Hello, and welcome to today's roundtable discussion of the Schiller Institute entitled Worsening U.S. Russian Relations: Reverse Them with a New Paradigm or Face Nuclear War. Before we start, we want to point out that yesterday marked the second anniversary of the death of the economist, statesman, and philosopher Lyndon LaRouche. He was known in particular for his economic forecasts, but also back in 1999, Mr. LaRouche composed a presentation which was called Storm Over Asia. And he was looking at the prospects for decades of war and destabilization. But he concluded that broadcast with a call for a new community of principle. And in both his honor and in order to begin our presentation today, we're going to play you the conclusion of that presentation, Storm Over Asia.
We have to have a sense of mission. And the mission now is, faced with the worst financial crisis in all world history, faced with the danger of new kinds of warfare, faced with the danger of a planet collapsing into a new dark age, we have to adopt as a sense of mission the determination that these things shall not happen. That we are going to mobilize our population and bring together the people of goodwill from around the world for a common purpose. The common purpose is to develop man and to build a community of principle among sovereign nation states, which will attack these problems as collaborators. In that work, typified by our need to accelerate our exploration of space, we as a nation and we as nations must adopt a sense of mission. We have to explore this universe. Do you know some of the terrible things that have happened to this planet in the past thousands of years? Do you know what happened when the glaciers went into their fast phase of melt? Do you know what happened to this planet about 12,000 years ago, when the glaciers were at their peak rate of melting? Did you know that whole civilizations were wiped out as the levels of the seas rose by 300 to 400 feet to the level, today's level, above which they had been earlier? Do you know the terrible things that meteorites and so forth have brought upon this planet? Do you know how vulnerable we are on this planet Earth? Because we have not yet been able to reach out and control some of the forces in the solar system and beyond, which might imperil the very existence of humanity in times to come. We have to get out into space. We have to understand the principles which operate there. We have to learn to control our environment, the environment of the solar system, as well as the environment of planet Earth. So therefore, in fighting against poverty, in fighting against war, and fighting against the threat to destruction of humanity in the future, we must adopt a sense of mission and national mission. In a larger sense, the same sense of mission that President Kennedy tried to provoke with his proposal, highly successful, remember, for a manned moon landing within the decade. It worked.
operational.
I think that with that example, we can say it would work again. This time, not just a man-moon landing, but beyond. And let's bring this planet into order at last. Let us build what John Quincy Adams envisaged as a global community of principle. And let's build it now before it's too late.
That higher dialogue of civilizations, based on a higher principle, sometimes called the coincidence of opposites, that supersedes momentary or even deep political divisions among nations, is now urgently required. We want to not only avoid the extermination of the planet, we want to have a planet that's fit for not only human habitation, but for the habitation of those that will come after us and for the development of our world. As it's been said by many, mankind will either put an end to war, or war will put an end to mankind. So as we meet today, there are 2 spacecraft that are hovering Mars, one from the United Arab Emirates and one from China, and they will be joined by a third by the time we get to next Saturday. The United States will also have its rover, Perseverance, at Mars. And so the possibility for that higher dialogue is certainly there, but only if we work for that purpose here. For over 36 years, 37 years almost now, the Schiller Institute has been doing that. And it was founded by Helga Zepp-LaRouche, who will now speak to us, followed by a panel, which we will then introduce at that point. So Helga, hello.
Hello, good day. So while the reason for optimism in respect to space cooperation is clearly there, and we will come to that a little bit later, the reason why we had the topic of this meeting is because the strategic situation clearly is extremely worrisome. Now, to start off with President Biden's first speech on foreign policy, he basically went tough on Russia and China. And, you know, this is in the context of the fact that the head of the U.S. Strategic Command, Admiral Richard, in an article in a newspaper called Proceedings, which is published by the U.S. Naval Institute, he made a very shocking statement by basically saying that there is the possibility that regional crises could quickly escalate in such a way where the use of nuclear weapon would become possible, and that when Russia or China would have the impression that they may be defeated conventionally, they may use nuclear weapons. And that therefore the Pentagon must be advised to change their assumption that nuclear war is not very likely to the idea that it is a very real possibility. Now, I think this is incredible. Now, what regional conflicts could he possibly mean? Well, he had already in the last half year many near collisions in the air where NATO or U.S. fighter jets almost collided with Russian jets near the Russian border. And I said at the time, you know, when world peace depends on the flying skill of pilots in order not to trigger an incident which could escalate into a larger one, then world peace is in a very, very fragile condition. Now, we have the reasons why the Russians are very upset about the Aegis-based missile defense systems in Poland and in Romania. We have the situation around the Baltic countries. We have the eastern Ukraine. Then naturally the potential conflict involving Israel and Iran is very worrisome, and naturally the situation around Taiwan. Now, I must say that the idea of a regional war in Europe is not exactly an attractive idea, given the fact that nobody in Europe would survive that. And what is maybe the most disturbing about this right now is that even, you know, there is clearly such a tension and a danger, nobody talks about it. This is very much different than it was in the medium missile crisis at the beginning of the 80s, where you had the SS-20 and the Pershing II in a distance of only less than 5 minutes from each other all the time, launch on warning. And at that time, the possibility of an accidental launch, if the one side would have seen a missile on their radar screen, thinking that the other side would possibly go for a launch, there were about 3, 4, 5 minutes time. And this was a situation where state leaders like Helmut Schmidt were saying, we are on the verge of World War III. And you had hundreds of thousands of people in the streets being aware that the war danger was very acute. And now nothing of this sort, which brings up the question, are we sleepwalking into a world war again? Now, I think on the question of a limited nuclear war, I mean, Admiral Richard did not talk about a limited nuclear war. He said a nuclear war being likely. But ever since the revolution in military affairs, there are some people who think that a limited nuclear war is winnable. Now, I have studied this matter since several years, and such nuclear weapon experts like Professor Theodor Postol from MIT have, in my view, very clearly made the argument why there is no such thing as a limited nuclear war. But the key difference between a conventional war and a nuclear war is that once one nuclear weapon is used, all of them will be used. So while China has stated again and again that they have no first strike in respect to nuclear weapons, and that the United States therefore should be calmed down about the danger of a nuclear weapon in response to Admiral Richard, they wrote this again, because China would never use nuclear weapons first. And therefore, if the US would not attack China, there was no danger of a nuclear war. This is not the case with Russia, where Putin has said very clearly that if Russia feels that its territory is being threatened, they may resort to a nuclear war, to a first strike. So this is what is behind this question of nuclear war. But there are also there are also operations for destabilization, regime change against Putin and against Xi Jinping. There was just a paper published by an anonymous author in the Atlantic Council, or by the Atlantic Council, called The Longer Telegram. This in clear reference to the 1946 paper by George Kennan, The Long Telegram, which was the beginning of the containment of Russia policy and the Cold War. And this time, this paper calls for an open toppling of Xi Jinping by saying, since it's not possible to topple 91 million members of the Communist Party, one should try to appeal to those people in the leadership of the Communist Party who are in opposition to Xi Jinping and his policy, and who don't like his permanent demands that they be loyal to him, and that therefore, they should be provoked to get rid of Xi Jinping and submit to the Western liberal order, and not try to pursue an alternative Chinese model, and being a challenge to the Western model of liberal democracy. Now that is really why there's all this attack on the so-called violations of human rights in Xinjiang, which we had members of the Schiller Institute travel there, and they confirmed completely that this is not torture, this is not brainwashing, this is not detention, but it is training programs to give people who were in the ambiance of terrorism a chance for economic prosperity, and that with economic development of this region, which used to be the poorest region of China, Xinjiang, that there is actually a different perspective being developed for the population. Hong Kong. Sure, there are people who like the Western liberal system more, but it is also a fact that there was a color revolution for regime change financed by the British and such organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy. Taiwan is one of the core interests of China because the One China policy, has been agreed to by most countries in the world, including the United States. So all of these conflicts, if they're being escalated, have clearly the seeds of miscalculation. Now, what is really at stake is this question of what is the order which will dominate the world. Now, it is often contested that there was never given a promise to Russia that NATO would not expand to the borders of Russia after 91. That emphatically is not true. Both Horst Teltschik, who was a high-ranking person in the Kohl government at the time, as well as Ambassador Matlock, testified that indeed promises had been given to Gorbachev that NATO would not move to the borders of Russia. However, while these promises were given, there was clearly already an effort to use the collapse of the communist Soviet Union to move towards an unipolar world. In the years following, there were regime change, color revolution, and various things. And when China was offered to join the WTO in 2001, there was absolutely the expectation that that would mean that China would completely join the Western system of democracy, of liberal economics, and naturally that would be the end of history, as Fukuyama had said earlier. Now, China instead did not become a Western democracy, but it used the integration into the world trade system to start a process of economic innovation. It went back to its 5,000 years of Chinese tradition and established what they call socialism with Chinese characteristics. Now, what that is not Marxist-Leninism, as is said by the State Department and by this paper of the Atlantic Council. What that is naturally there is a certain amount of focus on Karl Marx, but the majority of that is the 2,500-year tradition of Confucianism, the economic model, and this is a whole subject for a serious debate. The economic model of the Chinese is much more oriented towards Alexander Hamilton, national banking, the American system of economy. And it is not an accident that the German economist Friedrich List is the most popular economist in China. And they have modeled their entire system of innovation on that tradition of the American system, even though they don't discuss it that way, but it is that way. Now, that model has become very popular, especially with the introduction of the Belt and Road Initiative, which Xi Jinping did in 2013. And in the meantime, 150 countries have joined. And because of this system having certain advantages, China was very much able to fight the pandemic. In 2 months, they could really get rid of it more or less in Wuhan. And if it comes back, they can deal with it very nicely. They also got the economy back going. And, this is now clearly something which, is becoming a clear alternative, but it is not an offensive one. It is not an aggressive model. Now, the strategic partnership between Russia and China combines a very strong military nuclear capability of Russia. Putin responded to the American missile defense system by developing essentially after the ABM treaty was cancelled, weapons based on new physical principles, hypersonic missiles, which are not ballistic, but very maneuverable at Mach 20. Now that has thrown a real monkey wrench into all the calculations. Naturally, the United States and others are now developing also or working on hypersonic weapons. But as of now, Russia has the advantage. Now, that is why what is the Atlantic Council paper strategy for the regime change against Xi Jinping is the Navalny operation against Russia. Now, Navalny is, a typical Western intelligence promoted artificial figure. I mean, we have been following Navalny for many years. He was very unknown, a right-wing person, anti-immigrant, nasty in his convictions. He has made statements which, would make the Proud Boys blush in envy in terms of inclinations. And, but he is the darling now of the West. In 2012, this was published recently by RT, they produced a video where one of the key campaign managers of Navalny, Ashukov, I'm sorry. He met with the second secretary of the British Embassy in Moscow, a person called James William Thomas Ford, who is then identified as not being a diplomat, but working for MI6. Now, on that video, this Ashukov is basically telling this British diplomat, in quote, if you give us $10-20 million a year, we can organize demonstrations in the streets of Russia and, basically really become an important force. Now, we could talk about the Navalny case as such. There are many questions, and a very dubious role of even the German authorities in not cooperating with the Russian government. But the whole affair has all the earmarks of a typical Western intelligence operation, a false flag operation, very much like the Skripal affair, which also is not at all what it was made to be. And, as I said, this Navalny operation has the same purpose what is planned against Xi Jinping, in order to appeal against leading circles in Russia that they would get rid of Putin, and that Putin would be replaced with a leadership in Russia very much like Yeltsin was, with other words, not challenging the dominance of the Western liberal system, but basically submitting Russia to that order. And what is there, the plan was articulated by Madame Albright many years ago, that Russia has much too many raw materials in order to be allowed to exploit those on its own, but they really belong to the world, to the Western system. These policies have the danger of leading to World War III in the short term. And what is the purpose of this discussion today is we want to suggest a very different approach. I mean, it should be clear that if it comes to nuclear war, there will be nobody left, not even the people who instigated it. And can we, as a human species, not go back to principles, which make the survival of all nations on this planet possible? Now, we had the 75th anniversary of the UN Charter. And many of the ideas of Mahatma Gandhi and the idea of a nonviolent approach to international politics went into this charter, including the ideas of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. And I think we need, again, a discussion of these principles, which include mutual respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of each other, mutual non-aggression, mutual non-interference into the different social system of the other country, cooperation for the mutual benefit of each, and peaceful coexistence. Now, these principles are something which all nations can agree upon. It is the Charter of the United Nations. And if you think about it, especially in light of the words with which Lin concluded his program Storm over Asia, that we have to have a joint mission. The world is now faced with a pandemic, which is not under control. There is the danger of new strains. There's a race against time that vaccines may become not efficient when these new strains develop. And from the European health authorities, it was just published the concern that it may be impossible to get rid of this coronavirus, and that in mutated forms it may stay with humanity forever, and that we have to learn to live with that condition. Now, it is also possible that new pandemics develop. There is no guarantee that coronavirus, COVID-19, was the last pandemic. As a matter of fact, there are German experts who already are preparing for possible SARS, MERS mutations, and they expect outbreaks of those to be just a matter of time. Now, it is very clear, or it should be very clear, and this has been stated again and again by President Ramaphosa of South Africa, by Dr. Tedros from the World Health Organization, and many others, that this pandemic will not be defeated as long as it exists in any one country. Therefore, is it not the most important task in front of humanity that we work together to establish a world health system, meaning that each nation must have a modern health system to be able to cope with such diseases? Now, that would mean a modern health system like they demonstrated it to be in place in Wuhan, to build hospitals in a week for 1,000 people, but without clean water, no hospitals. 2 billion people in the world don't have clean water. It means electricity. It means infrastructure, because if you don't have infrastructure, you cannot service all of these things. So let's suggest that the building of a modern health system in every nation of the world must be the beginning of overcoming the underdevelopment of the developing countries. Now, Putin, a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago, proposed a meeting, a conference of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council to address the most challenging questions of humanity. And I think 1 year later, these challenges have not become less, they have become more. David Beasley of the World Food Programme is warning that this year alone, 270 million people are in immediate danger of starvation, which will come on top of the pandemic. So can we not join efforts to cooperate to double food production in light of the fact that the population will increase to be soon 9 billion people, and therefore to double the food production is an absolutely meaning proposal. Now, President Biden just made a speech where he said, well, look, the Chinese have high-speed trains. They go 225 miles an hour. And, we have to step up or else they eat our lunch. So that is exactly the right kind of thinking. China has 30,000 miles of fast train system already built. These trains do go about 250 miles an hour. They're already working on a test run of 600 kilometers an hour. That's about 450 miles an hour of a maglev train. So the United States urgently needs a modern transport system, a fast train system, and a rebuilding. And can we not make that shift and go into the idea of a coincidence of opposites to work together. Coincidence of opposites is a notion by Nicolaus of Cues, a great thinker of the 15th century, who said that the human mind can always establish that higher level of reason where the one has a higher power than the many. Now, that is what we have to accomplish. We have to think about the one humanity. Chancellor Merkel said recently, actually at the virtual Davos conference, that she thinks that the idea of building a bloc here around the United States, there around China, and that then Europe has to choose, she does not like that idea, but she thinks that the idea of multilateralism has come. Now, multilateralism is better than geopolitical confrontation, but it does include the germ of such a confrontation simply because it still defines the interest of blocs, of nations against nations, and therefore has the seed of conflict. What we propose is something different. It is the idea that in light of the possible extinction of humanity through nuclear war, that we create a world where the interest of the one humanity comes first, and that we totally change the way we are thinking. And let me conclude with one thought. There is a beautiful video by Sarah Al-Amiri, who is the head of the space agency of the United Arab Emirates. She's a 33-year-old, very, very fantastic woman who already in 2017 made a video where she talked about the HOPE Mars mission, where she was in charge of now with its success. But she says, look, you should stick your finger in the air and then look at the sky and look at the little place which your finger points to. And the Hubble telescope made pictures of this little area. And what you see is thousands and thousands, not of stars, not of planets, but galaxies. And she says there are trillions of galaxies, and we should really think in this way, that we are the one mankind who can conquer the secrets of this fantastic universe. So I think that if all the leaders of state, all the heads of state, all the presidents and chancellors and minister presidents would really put up the eyes to the star and understand that we are living on a tiny blue planet in a huge universe, in a universe which Hubble has established 2 trillion galaxies minimum, and it is expanding still. So if we start to think that, is it not foolish to try to extinct our species on the planet when we could work together, to colonize space, to find out the secrets of the universe, and really understand that we are the one human race and that we have a mission. The mission is to overcome poverty on Earth, to conquer diseases, to become human, and to become adult. And that president, no matter from what country he is, who subscribes to these ideas, will be a great man or a great woman in history.
Thank you very much, Helga. And now what we're going to do is we're going to turn to our round table. I'd like to introduce them all now, and we will proceed. So we have with us today Ray McGovern, co-founder of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. We have Alex Craner, is the author of Grand Deception, The Truth About Bill Browder, the Magnitsky Act, and Anti-Russian Sanctions. Harley Schlanger, who has, of course, a daily blog, and people here on this channel particularly know him very well, writer for EIR, and Diane Sayre, who is a candidate for the United States Senate, running against Chuck Schumer in New York. We'll also be joined a little later by Mike Gravel, former U.S. Senator and 2020 Democratic presidential candidate. Before we go to the panel, we're going to hear from Mr. Edward Lazansky. He was unable to be with us, but he prepared a video. He is the president of the American University in Moscow and professor of world politics at Moscow State University.
Thank you for giving me the chance to address this prestigious audience. I want to admit that when I read article by Admiral Richard in my favorite paper, the Washington Times, when I occasionally also place my op-eds about possibility of nuclear war. This, of course, to say that it was kind of a shock, it's maybe not enough, because I am, just as it happens, a great admirer of President Ronald Reagan, and I had the privilege to shake his hand in the White House during this some of the ceremonies. Then we praised Soviet Nobel Peace Laureate Andrei Sakharov, because he was also worried about dangers of nuclear war, and he got the Nobel Peace Prize. Being the architect, he actually was father of Soviet hydrogen bomb. At the same time, he wanted to make sure that it is never used, and he found a great admirer with President Ronald Reagan, who also said that nuclear war is unthinkable. And he joined in this pledge with Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. So we thought that with people with reputation like Ronald Reagan, Mikhail Gorbachev, and Nobel Peace Laureate Andrei Sakharov, the father of the hydrogen bomb, could say that only like lunatics can speak about nuclear war, because it will be end of civilization as we know it. And after reading this article, no, this is something that makes not only me worry. I know that a lot of people get a little bit, to say, upset. It's not enough. So question is, what we, ordinary people, we are not in the government, we are private citizen. I am teaching actually a course. As the president of American University, I also teach course in my alma mater, Institute of Nuclear Research is my background. I'm a nuclear physicist. And so my course is to Russian students. I do it sometimes online, sometimes when I'm in Moscow, I do it in person. And I talk about dangers, of course, of nuclear war and what we can do to avoid it. So maybe during my short presentation, I'll show you a couple of slides from my course, because I, of course, don't pretend that I'm professor of U.S. students. But I thought it'll be interesting to see the message which comes straight from Washington to students, future nuclear scientists of the top, most prestigious Russian university. But I want to start with a very brief summary of my colleagues at the Brown University. They have Worsen Center, International Center, and Brown University, as all of us know, it's an Ivy League school, and they did research cost of war. They didn't even talk about nuclear war, just war. And what happened in 21st century with United States making some of those projects, war projects, under presidents George Bush Jr., of course, and of course Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, and of course Barack Obama, and current President Joe Biden. He was chair of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, and he voted practically for all war which those gentlemen that I mentioned, they started. And here are the results. Again, this is Brown University, one of the most prestigious American schools. It's not Putin propaganda. You can see the numbers. Over 800,000 people have died due to direct war violence. We are talking about just 21st century. And several times as many indirectly. Over 335,000 civilians have been killed as a result of the fighting. And the horrible thing of 37 million number of war refugees and displaced persons. And of course, material damage to the United States budget. The US federal price tag for 9/11 wars is over $6.4 trillion. This is a result of the work of George W. Bush. So it's kind of a bipartisan. We talk about Barack Obama with encouragement and vote of current President George I'm sorry, keep repeating. I hope you will correct this. Joe Biden. President Trump, of course, we can criticize him for many things, and actually, I have to admit, in some of my columns in Washington Times, I also criticize him. But his greatest achievement in foreign policy is that he didn't start a single war. Well, this is something that maybe I think is a good achievement. But now, when Joe Biden is saying that he wants to go back, he wants to back to the same U.S. foreign policy. He wants to restore American hegemony, American leadership. He wants to be at the head of the table. I'm worried, and I think many people worry because this is what happened under Joe Biden in the Senate. He approved all those things. So now, maybe question again, what to do? And I try to teach my students, and maybe I will show you a couple of slides from my course is U.S. Russia Relations. Okay, I just will show you a few slides from my course. And of course, I want to start with the picture of Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, those two men, which I had a great pleasure and honor to meet, shake hands, and talk about how we can preserve world peace, both in the White House and the Kremlin. So, and then when the slide, which is something that I show to my students, that this is the area when US and Russia can cooperate and for mutual benefit. We see about 20 different areas, from space to agriculture to health, especially currently, we talk about vaccines and all that, business development, cyber, all those areas where US and Russia can benefit each other if we work together instead of fighting and, God forbid, nuclear war. Now, space, of course, it's Russian-American astronauts right now, by the way, right now in space. This is a course I teach, which, by the way, on the picture is the president of my university, but on the right is a secret hacker. He's former head of the Los Alamos lab, and he's now a professor at Stanford. So we are working together with two major American universities to talk about cooperation and instead of fighting. Those are some of our students, but I want to show you this one. Those two sculptures, very symbolic, because they're in downtown Moscow, and we see Abraham Lincoln and Russian Tsar Alexander II, the same guy who really helped America during the Civil War. And then another sculpture is of Soviet and American soldiers who met in the Elbe River on April 25, 1945. And this was actually the symbolic meeting to end the World War II with Nazi regime. Now, this is a great photo. We planted a tree, friendship tree between Russia and America. The gentleman on the left is science attaché of the American embassy in Moscow. And we planted this tree. I'll show you in a little bit. And you see American-Russian flag flying. And this is in downtown Moscow. This is what I show to my students. And I wanted to show this to the audience today. Now, this is a great photo. On the left, General Bruce McClinton, he's defense attaché at the American embassy in Moscow. On the right side is a famous Russian cosmonaut, Alexei Leonov, who flew in space with Americans, Apollo Soyuz. He was the commander of the Soviet spaceship, which they met and linked in America. So now, again, we see Russian and American generals shaking hands. They're celebrating Elbe River. This is a famous picture on the Elbe when Soviet and American soldiers shake their hand. And I want to finish this presentation, which is very important now, by President Tom Jefferson, who is saying, we wish not to meddle with the internal affairs of any country. The reason I will show you this slide, because I think recently I saw a tweet which from Foreign Minister Lavrov, which wasn't really anywhere in US media. And Sergei Lavrov suggested, he said, let's start with a very simple thing. We're talking about lack of dialogue. So let's start with two most important pledges. First of all, of course, that no nuclear war, my way repeating this what Ronald Reagan, Gorbachev, and then that we pledge not to meddle in our internal affairs. No response so far from the United States, and this is too bad, because why not the two obvious things? No one wants nuclear war, and Americans don't want Russians to meddle in our elections, and so think Russians also don't want Americans to meddle. Why don't we start with this one? I would add also, in addition to nuclear, also cyber weapons, because nowadays cyber weapons are maybe now becoming even more dangerous. So, well, this is, sorry for my very brief introduction to the audience. And this is what I teach to my students. I want to conclude my short presentation with the idea that my students and many other students in Russian and American university probably will take part in. This is on April 25, when we usually celebrate this anniversary of Elbe River meeting on the Elbe River. Then we want to have a flash mob, and those who have a chance to plant a tree, friendship tree. This friendship tree, it serves several purposes. First of all, we honor veterans. If we don't have a veteran in the family, we can order any distinguished American or Russian, of course, famous writer, musician, athlete, whoever you choose. But then it also serves the purpose of reducing the CO2 saturation in the atmosphere, because every tree absorbs certain elements of CO2. And if we plant a trillion trees, then we can really reduce this CO2, and maybe this is what President Joe Biden wants. He wants to fight climate change. So why don't we fight climate change together by planting trees? It's very easy, and at the same time we honor our relatives, friends who fought in all those wars, and so it's several purposes. This is Sunday, April 25, and it will be, we plan this to have like a holiday. It will be joint holiday. I'm delighted that President Donald Trump, he supported this idea. Actually, first one, I expressed it in the article, the same newspaper, Washington Times, which Admiral Richard talked about nuclear war. We suggested that maybe two presidents, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, they issued joint declaration remembering this meeting on Elbe and pledging that we are not going to fight, but we want to be friends. And both Donald Trump and President Putin did that. They issued a joint declaration. It's easily available on the web. Now we have, maybe if Vladimir Putin agreed and Donald Trump, so why not Joe Biden? Wouldn't it be nice if President Biden does that? Because this is something will be, in addition to his pledge to unite all Americans. Now we see now that America is now divided. Maybe if we do this joint things together, maybe we will stop talking about war, maybe stop how to implement those 20 different projects that I mentioned in the slide, that we can work together and benefit both nations. Thank you so much for giving me a chance to make this presentation, and I hope to see all of you, because it will be flash mob on the Facebook or some other platforms, so we maybe can extend hands to each other over the ocean.
We want to thank Professor Lazansky for his presentation. Our next speaker will be Ray McGovern. Now, Ray has been a CIA analyst for 27 years, I think from the administrations of John Kennedy to George Bush 41, if I'm not mistaken. In January of 2003, he co-created what was called Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. And the purpose of this organization was, at that time in particular, to expose how intelligence was being falsified to justify war on Iraq. It's always good when you're talking about stopping war to work with those people who know something about what war is, what intelligence is, how intelligence is in fact falsified and how wars are started as a result of that. And so we'd like to welcome Ray, who's been on our platform other times, to give us some remarks at this point. So, Ray.
Thank you, Dennis. It's a good idea. It's a very good idea to be discussing these things in this kind of forum. You won't find any such discussion in what we call major media in our country. Let me do just a little bit of a historical review. It won't take long. I've always been puzzled to think why Russia and China all of a sudden became our major enemies again. I mean, here's President George W. Bush just about 18 years ago. Today, the world's great powers are united by common values. Russia is reaching for its democratic future and a partner in the war on terror. The Chinese leaders, we welcome their peaceful pursuit of prosperity, trade, and cultural advancement. Whoa! That sounds pretty rapprochement-ish or détente-ish or let's live on this planet together-ish. So what happened? What happened? Well, there are a lot of people that make a lot of money producing and selling arms. That's the short answer. My acronym is no longer just the MIC, the Military Industrial Complex. I use an acronym that, remember this, rhymes with Mickey Mouse. That's the way you remember it. It's the Mickey Mat. It's the Military Industrial Congressional Intelligence Media Academia Think Tank Complex, Mickey Mat. Why do I say media? Because media is the linchpin. Without media, you can't do this. And who owns the media? The rest of the Mickey Mat. Okay, so that's the basic thing that we have to contend with. That's what sort of came into vogue as President Putin started making Russia a repaired country after the devastation of Yeltsin and the 1990s. So what would I say next? Well, I would say that despite all the anti-Russian rhetoric, there was one shining moment where Mr. Putin came to Mr. Obama's aid and pulled his chestnuts out of the fire. Now, I don't know what motivated Obama, but he didn't want to have an open U.S. military war on Syria. It's quite enough to spend billions of dollars on covert action and funding insurgents, but he didn't want to be attacking Syria because he had sense enough to know what that would mean over the longer term. So what did you do? Well, when this faux chemical attack occurred outside Damascus on the 21st of August of 2013, all hell broke loose. John Kerry said, Bashar al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad did this. He said it 25 times in one speech. What did Obama do? Obama cut Kerry out of the consultations. He went to St. Petersburg for a summit, and he talked to Mr. Putin. And Mr. Putin said, look, we can get you out of this mess without a war. We have persuaded the Syrians to give up these residual chemical weapons that they have for destruction under UN supervision on a U.S. ship specially outfitted for destroying chemical weapons. What do you think, Mr. Obama? I said, you could do that? He said, yeah, watch tomorrow. Prime Minister of Syria is going on TV. Sure enough, that's the way it worked out, okay? Now, why do I mention all that? That was sort of the zenith. That was the acme of a potential détente in U.S.-Russian relations. What happened? Well, we know what happened. We're talking early September 2013. 5-6 months later, the Victoria Nulands of our government fomented what was called the most blatant coup in history, it having been advertised on YouTube 2.5 weeks before, and Ukraine was turned into turmoil. Now, after that, there was the MI-17, where John Kerry got up and said, we have the information. We know who shot that plane down. We know where it was shot from, and we know exactly when it was shot. And we have technical information to prove that. Well, actually, he never came through with that technical information, and all of our allies in Europe were afraid to ask him. Okay. And so what did they use that for? Sanctions. And our European allies, even though they couldn't sell their apples to Russia, they went right along docilely as sheep, as they usually do. So if that was the zenith, this was the low point in U.S.-Russian relations. And what follows from that, of course, we all know. Now, after the Ukraine coup, and you might listen to this because this may be new to some of you, there's one intelligence organization in our government called the Defense Intelligence Agency. And sometimes it acts, well, how we say, independently. Sometimes it looks at the facts, interprets them, and tells it like it is. Now, listen carefully to the main conclusion of the December 2015, so a year after Ukraine, the 2015 National Security Strategy of the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. Quote, the Kremlin is convinced the United States is laying the groundwork for regime change in Russia, a conviction further reinforced by the events in Ukraine. Moscow views the United States as the critical driver behind the crisis in Ukraine and believes that the overthrow of former Ukrainian President Yanukovych is the latest move in a long-standing, long-established pattern of U.S. orchestrated regime change efforts. Long-established pattern of U.S. orchestrated regime change efforts. How does Navalny fit into that? We can discuss that later, perhaps. This was signed by Lieutenant General Vincent Stewart, Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. The date, December 2015. Whoa, somebody told it like it was, like it is. Now, does anybody have any confusion about why DIA was frozen out of all these assessments having to do with how bad President Putin is and how he orchestrated the defeat of Hillary Clinton? Does anyone know now, could kind of figure out why DIA, who had primary responsibility for the GRU, which was accused of all manner of evil things, why it was frozen out of those deliberations, and the deliberations limited to a handful, General Clapper's word, of handpicked analysts? Well, DIA didn't qualify because DIA had a ridiculous habit of telling the truth. Now, what does this all mean? This general who's shooting his mouth off, that's really dangerous. I mean, if you read Dan Ellsberg's book, The Doomsday Machine, well, let me put it this way. If you haven't read Dan Ellsberg's book, you really need to. Because not only does he talk about the Navy Captain Arkhipov, who is single-handedly responsible for us being able to be together today, or virtually together, but he talks about during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the former commander of the Strategic Air Command, the fellow who was in the position that Admiral Richard is now in, he sent a plane, a bomber, into Soviet airspace. And when Kennedy learned about that, he said, oh my God, right at the height of this thing, SAC wasn't supposed to do that. Why did SAC do that? Well, you got to read Dan Ellsberg's book and see how crazy these guys are, how they think that Mr. Putin and Russians are the devil incarnate, okay? That's how you figure that out. Now, What happened, of course, was that Kennedy tried to slough it off by saying, well, there's always one guy that doesn't get the word. But they were on tenterhooks for a while until the Russians said, look, would you tell these kind of cowboy pilots not to do that anymore? So there's precedent for getting right up to the brim. And now with response time reduced because of these supersonic weapons and so forth, it's very, very labile, as the Germans would say. Last thing is this. Oliver Stone happens to be a friend of mine. And as you know, Oliver has interviewed Mr. Putin more times than most other correspondents. He told me this. He said that after one interview, and this was not recorded, but Oliver remembers it quite distinctly, and you will see why. He said that after one of these conversations, Mr. Putin, somewhat exasperated, said something along the lines of, quote, now Russians are thought of like Jews before World War II, period, end quote. Well, those who have a modicum of knowledge about Jews and before World War II, people who are blamed for just about everything, including Hillary Clinton blaming Russia for January 6th disturbances in the capital of our country. I mean, that's a mindset that is inevitable when you're because you'll push the scapegoat of anything that goes wrong. So what we need to say here is that I have with Mr. Biden, against all this history, I have a glass half full attitude. Why would I say that? Well, number one, he is appointed as head of the CIA, Bill Burns. Bill Burns was ambassador to Moscow. Bill Burns knows the equities. He knows his history. He knows that Moscow, in the person of Sergei Lavrov, warned him explicitly against adopting Ukraine into NATO and Georgia too. As a matter of fact, his cable, courtesy of WikiLeaks, starts out by saying, Mr. Burns, do you know what "niet" means? Burns said, yeah, I think so. He said, well, "niet" means "niet," and that's our red line. No Ukraine admission into NATO, and the same for Georgia. Now, 2 months later, NATO approved their application, or they're beginning their application to do that. So it's not as though Burns is coming at this as kind of a sophomore. He's a senior, and that's a good thing. He knows about the Russians. In that same cable, I would add, he says in a very undiplomatic way, because you don't say this to the Secretary of State, because you know where she stands. This happened to be Condoleezza Rice. He says, the real way the Russians look at Ukraine, look how far Kiev is from Moscow. They have their own strategic interests here. And sotto voce, they're entitled to their own strategic interests. Okay, so he says that in the cable. So one thing that Mr. Biden can expect is some knowledgeable, hopefully honest assessments from the CIA of all places. What next? Well, Biden's quick re-upping of the New START treaty, 5 years right off the bat. Now, New START. Look, I was in Moscow for the first SALT agreement, May 7th, 1972. Okay. So I know how meaningful these agreements were. This was the only one left. And instead of fooling around with it, Biden says, we're up, we're in, okay? Now, that move is worth 18,000 Navalnys and 13,000 pretended bounties and 6,000 alleged hacks, okay? That's a big move. And not only that, but as the readout of the conversation between Mr. Biden and Mr. Putin was, from the U.S. side, it said, we agreed that maybe we've moved down this road toward other arms control agreements. Whoa. Now, the people who see merit in demonizing Russia, that's a big problem. And Biden will have to deal with that. Whether he can deal with it successfully or not, Trump couldn't, Obama couldn't. But, Biden's almost as old as I am, for God's sake. I mean, and he knows a lot of the misery that he caused on Iraq and other things. There's always a chance for growth. And besides that, he's a one-term president. So I see that he has more leeway than most people. And that's why I have a glass half full. Give him some time and we'll see how things turn out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ray. Alex Craner is a financial analyst. He wrote a book called Grand Deception, The Truth About Bill Browder, the Magnitsky Act, and Anti-Russian Sanctions. In his book, among other things, he says that Browder conducted a, quote, campaign of relentless demonization of Russia and of Vladimir Putin. And as humanity finds itself on the precipice of yet another great war, what we need are bridges of mutual understanding and constructive engagement, not demonization. So, Alex, are you there? Very good.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, we can.
Very well. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for Mrs. Helga Zepp-LaRouche and Harley Schlanger for this invitation. I'm honored and privileged to join you today. And so basically, what I'd like to tell you about is my view of the current affairs, and I think that it's a larger context that takes perhaps several centuries worth of perspective. And as I've discovered, what we're seeing today is a continuity of the strategy of the British Empire, which was formulated already by Sir Halford Mackinder in his 1919 Democratic Ideals and Reality, where he wrote that who rules East Europe commands the heartland, who rules the heartland commands the world island, and who rules the world island controls the world. Having exhausted itself in continued warfare, the British Empire transferred its seat of power to the United States. I think it's the arrangement that's been maybe metaphorically popularized in the Mad Max movies, if you remember the Master Blaster duo, where the blaster was the strong, muscly guy, and the master was the small, decrepit old guy who was running the blaster. And so, some 70 years after Sir Halford Mackinder's write-up, Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote up his game plan in 1986. And there he reaffirmed the same strategy: whoever controls Eurasia dominates the globe. And so today, at the blaster level, we have the U.S. Department that today has a Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs. And the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs used to be Victoria Nuland. And the man who came in her place by 2018 was Wes Mitchell. And in August in 2018, he delivered a statement to the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And in that statement, he reaffirmed that the central aim of the administration's foreign policy was to defend the United States domination of Eurasian landmass as the foremost U.S. national security interest, and to prepare the nation for this challenge. So I think, please keep in mind this part, to prepare the nation for this challenge. And so other things that were mentioned in that report was that confronting Russia would be among the highest priorities for the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, and that all 50 missions in Europe and Eurasia were required to develop, coordinate, and execute tailored action plans for rebuffing Russian influence operations in their host countries. Wes Mitchell also mentioned that the Bureau created a team of dedicated professionals to take offensive and to publicly expose Russian malign activities. And so he boasted that between January and August 2018, 7 months. They called out the Kremlin on 112 occasions. I mention this because I think this is the context within which we should understand the Navalny affair. It's simply a continuation of the same agenda, which is grasping at any straw to drag Russia through the mud and to malign its role in the world. Finally, the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs created a new position in 2018, which was the Senior Advisor for Russian Malign Activities and Trends, which has an acronym SARMAT. Wes Mitchell mentioned also that the department is working with our quote-unquote, with our close ally, the United Kingdom, to form an international coalition for coordinating efforts in this field. So again, this is the context, I think, within which Navalny affair should be read. And as we recently saw, Navalny and his officers are actively coordinating with the British MI6 and probably other Western non-governmental organizations, intelligence organizations, and who knows what else. That this is a real threat to world peace could be read from German foreign minister's Sigmar Gabriel's statement, which he gave in his interview with Bild am Sonntag, saying that the shattered relationship between Russia and the United States was the greatest threat to peace across the globe, and that unless the two powers find common ground, our children would inherit a dangerous and very uncertain world. Well, I think that these uncertainties today are extremely worrisome, not just with respect to Western relationship with Russia, but also China and Iran. Indeed, it appears that certain powers in the West are actively planning for an escalation of this conflict. So, in September 2016, the Atlantic Council published a report that was predicting a world marked by the breakdown of order, violent extremism, and an era of perpetual war. The enemies the Atlantic Council underscored were Russia and China, of course. Not long after that, in November 2018, the bipartisan National Defense Strategy Commission, appointed by the U.S. Congress, issued a rather lengthy report titled Providing for the Common Defense. And in this report, they declared that a great power competition, and not terrorism anymore, is now the primary focus of the U.S. military. And the report gave backing to the Pentagon's plan to prepare for a great power war against Russia, China, or both. The report envisioned that this war would break out within 4 years, which from that time means that will be 2022, that the war would be horrendous and devastating, but all of society would need to be mobilized in a whole of nation, in a whole of nation effort, including everything from private corporations to academic institutions. So you see, there's this theme of preparing the nation that keeps recurring in these reports, in Wes Mitchell's report to the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee and so forth, which does indicate certain coordination and intent to bring this conflict about, or at least escalate the Cold War confrontations. And I think that from today's perspective, all this, nuclear confrontation that we're talking about, it may seem unthinkable. However, I think we should not be complacent in face of such plans. I think just over a century ago, the outbreak of World War I caught almost everyone entirely by surprise. In 1919, in Economic Consequences of the Peace, Keynes wrote about the peaceful, prosperous state of affairs in London in the early days of 1914. And he noted that the state seemed normal, certain, and permanent. So the world seemed secure at the beginning of 1914. The American historian Alexander Noyes, also writing in 1925, noted the suddenness with which World War I broke out, and the total absence of popular belief in the possibility of any such event up to the very week in which it became, in which it began, the war. So I can personally relate to this surprising turn of event, because as a young man I lived through the breakout of war in the former Yugoslavia, and I served in the Croatian army during the war. And the remarkable thing about that escalation was that the conflict, only a few days before it began, the conflict was almost unthinkable, and I think nobody believed that there could be war. And I certainly didn't think it would happen myself. Yugoslavia's ethnicities, cultures, and religions were intertwined in many ways over many generations. And while we did have our haters, most people by far did not want to hate their neighbors, did not want war, and positively wanted to preserve peace. However, once the shooting started and once the destruction began to happen and there were casualties, everything very quickly and very suddenly changed. The society is rapidly polarized. Empathy for the other side quickly went out of fashion. The pacifism became unpatriotic, and political opposition became tantamount to treason. At present, we can still talk about Russia, about China, about Iran and their leaders in somewhat nuanced terms. We can exchange opposing opinions and disagree. However, a hot war with either nation would still be unthinkable to most people. All the same, one provocation, one false flag incident credibly attributed to either Russia or China could dramatically change all that. And our societies might suddenly polarize, and the collective psyche could morph into the black and white, us against them mode. Nobody should think this impossible. 2 world wars had already broken out on the European continent, and we should take the lessons of the past seriously so we don't complacently sleep into the 3rd one. On the optimistic note, I think that even though the state of affairs today seems ominous, we, the ordinary civilians, should not be discouraged and should not assume that we have no power to change things. Confucius wrote that a seed grows with no sound, but a tree falls with huge noise. Destruction has noise, but creation is quiet. This is the power of silence. The seeds that Confucius mentions is us, and I believe that our endeavors to preserve and build a robust, lasting peace will find fertile grounds today. Even after nearly 2 decades of unnuanced demonization, a 2019 Rasmussen report found that 56% of U.S. voters agree that having Russia in a friendly posture as opposed to always fighting with them is an asset to our world and to the United States, not a liability, and only 24% of them disagreed. I think that with this presentation, I'm probably preaching to the choir, but perhaps the audience of this podcast might find some news in what I just delivered. So I wish to thank you for your attention.
And we want to thank you also, Alex, for what you had to say. Now we're going to go to somebody that a lot of people ought to know and ought to know better. There's a book that some of us grew up on, literally, the Pentagon Papers. Mike Gravel began serving his nation in the Alaska House of Representatives, I believe, in 1963 through 1967. I think I was 10 years old when he got involved, became Speaker of the Assembly, and then he got elected to the United States Senate. And he was at the center of not just dramatic events, but life-changing events for some of us, because he was the person that required, shall we say, that the Pentagon Papers, which revealed the true history of the Vietnam War, be made public. It was an act of courage which was critical to shaping the standard for a lot of people as to what a public servant is supposed to do. Mike also ran, as I understand, for 2020 for the U.S. presidential election. He's still active. It's not only always an honor to introduce him, but it's an important moment of reflection in that today in America, the lack of institutional memory, particularly where that institutional memory has been truthful, being conveyed to the individual citizen, that lack is probably our greatest national weakness. And so he's here today to talk to us about the issue of war, the issue of friends and enemies, and the issue of perhaps trying to make something happen by standing up on your own to cause people to see that principles cannot be shunned to the side in an hour of adversity. So, Mike? You're on, Mike. Can you hear us? Mike? Try speaking.
Can you hear me? Can
Yes.
you hear
Yeah.
me?
Yes.
Problem is that other conversation is distractive and it's on top of mine, so I don't think
You may.
anybody can make a discernible. Uh,
We're
okay,
able to hear you clearly. Are you hearing something else as interference?
yes, there's another conversation, but there isn't right now. Yeah,
Okay.
I can hear you.
All right. Well, if you go ahead and speak, your signal's coming through to us very clearly right now.
But what about this other voiceover?
I'm not sure what that is, or we're not hearing anything in the transmission right now. We're only hearing you speaking to us. That's it.
Yeah, I hear another conversation going on.
Yeah, maybe what we'll do then, Mike, is we'll go to Harley Schlanger, and the technical people will try to resolve the problem. Because if that's interfering with your ability to concentrate, we just try to channel it out. Okay, because we're not picking up anything on our end. Okay, so we'll just come back to
Okay,
you.
well,
Okay.
if maybe the other voice will disappear as I
I know,
proceed.
but I think it's better to try to work it through so you can concentrate. Okay. So why don't we do that? Can we go to Harley? And fine, we'll just go to Harley and come back to Mike. So Harley Schlanger, who is been a lot of things and has been associated with Lyndon LaRouche for as long as I have been, which is about 50 years. Runs a daily blog that people have seen, people who are associated with the LaRouche organization website, and be actually, for that matter, who just get his individual daily pearls of wisdom. So he's here to talk to us. Okay, so Harley, take it away, and then we'll go back to Mike.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. There's been a lot of useful ideas presented, and what I want to do is go back to the fundamental question that comes up, which is trying to answer the question of why is there a possibility of war between the United States and Russia? Are there fundamental principles that put us into conflict that would lead to such a confrontation? Now, I think the answer to the second question is no. There's no legitimate, reasonable basis for war or even increasing tensions. There's a long history of relations between the U.S. and Russia on common interests. And what most importantly in that common interest is an anti-imperial outlook. But there is a real possibility of increased tension and even an outbreak of war, as we heard especially from Helga. Well, why is that? What is the issue of contention? And I'm just going to develop the point that it comes from not something inherent in the United States, but British imperial geopolitics, which, in spite of many people's view that the British Empire is a thing of the past, it is not only still present, but it's shaping many aspects of U.S. policy. Now, Lyndon LaRouche has always emphasized that to understand the conflict that exists in the world, especially between the U.S. and Russia, you have to understand this question of sovereign nations taking on an empire, or I should say an empire, trying to stop sovereign nations from acting in the interests of their populations. We've seen this throughout modern history. At the end of World War II, Franklin Roosevelt had an intention of continuing the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union. But with his death, that was sabotaged. When Truman came in and fell under the influence of Winston Churchill, we had the Cold War, as Helga referenced, the long telegram of 1946, which laid out the strategy of containment, which was the basis for a very long-lasting Cold War. But this confrontation goes back before World War II, long before it. In fact, as Alex was talking about, there's an unbroken continuity going back to the American Revolution, but in particular to the role of British geopolitics as put forward by Mackinder, actually in his famous speech in 1904, where he emphasized the importance of making sure there was never an alliance of Eurasian nations and Europe, because that would interfere with British control of the seas, British control of trade, British control of monetary policy. Now, and by the way, that's what led to World War I, that policy of pitting France and Russia against Germany, and France and Russia on the side of Britain. Now, in the 1920s, after the devastation of World War I, they took a slightly different strategy. And it was the emergence of corporate trusts, which were formed in particular between American firms centered in Wall Street, London firms, United Kingdom corporations, and some in Germany. The idea was to keep the United States and Britain as allies and keep Germany under control. There was a name for this. Before fascism, it was called corporatism. And there was a specific aspect of corporatism called synarchism, which was the use of left and right-wing violent groups to break up societies, to carry out confrontations, and to create the basis for a top-down state to suppress it through emergency decrees. This was really the case with the Reichstag fire, the emergency decree that was declared that gave Hitler the power to completely take over every aspect of the German economy. And it was entrusted to a man named Hjalmar Schacht, who was the agent of these corporate trusts. Now, the trusts were largely based on London and Wall Street interests, and some of the names involved are very familiar. Rockefeller, Morgan, DuPont, Harriman, some less so, such as Thomas Lamont of the Morgan banking interests, who was directly responsible for building these trusts. But what the role of these trusts was to usurp the power of nation states, of national governments, to act on behalf of the interests of their people. Instead, to put that power into the hands of multinational institutions, including finance, the steel trust, the chemical trust, food production trust, and so on. And in Germany, after the emergency decree was declared, Schacht was given carte blanche to take the German population and put them essentially into slave labor projects to work on behalf of these trusts. Now, in the post-war period, this was obviously such an abhorrent practice because we know where these slave labor camps led, to the death camps of the Third Reich. But these were largely the extension of the policy of cheap labor and the ability to grind out extra income from primitive accumulation against a population. Now, after World War II, that was no longer acceptable to do, at least on the surface. And so there were various efforts to try and figure out how to make it work. One was through a Tavistock Institute figure named Kurt Lewin, a brainwasher who tried to set up projects in participatory democracy, trust building, things of that sort, group dynamics, to get people to speed themselves up and to work on behalf of their corporations against their interests. Another example, a little more exotic one, was Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Used drugs to deaden people's response so they'll accept the conditions that otherwise they wouldn't accept it. But even with these kinds of deployments, the United States under John Kennedy experienced a rebirth of optimism, scientific and technological optimism. But undergirding that was Kennedy's opposition to the idea of empire. He reverted back to Franklin Roosevelt's view of ending colonialism and of building a world of free states that could cooperate. And this was especially important after his experience with the Cuban Missile Crisis and his desire to end the Cold War with Russia. Now, Kennedy was assassinated. When Nixon came in, he brought into his administration a figure who was directly related to this trust operation at 120 Broadway in New York, namely George Shultz, whose father was an operative of these Harriman, Morgan, Rockefeller interests. By the way, it should be noted that a junior partner in the Morgan and in the Harriman interests was none other than Prescott Bush, the father of a U.S. president and the grandfather of another, both of whom worked very closely with Shultz. Just going to very briefly identify Shultz's role because this is crucial to understand how we're at the point today where the Great Reset represents the drive of this British Empire to end the potential of sovereign states to oppose this global policy. Shultz was there on the scene when Nixon was convinced to break the Bretton Woods Agreement of Franklin Roosevelt, to remove the gold reserve as a basis for the dollar, and to open up floating exchange rates. Again, this was in the interests of speculators on Wall Street, not in the interests of the actual industry and businesses of the United States. Shultz left at the end of when Nixon left. Shultz ended up at Bechtel, which is a part of the military-industrial complex, only to be brought back in as Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan. His role in the Reagan administration is often limited to these comments that he was a reasonable man. He worked with Reagan to get détente with Russia. But the real story is much more nefarious. He was a leading promoter of British free trade policy, which at the time was the formation of the GATT, the move toward free trade between nations, deregulation based on the Thatcher Big Bang model, which did away with regulation of banking and finance, environmentalism. And another point that should be interesting to people who know about Lyndon LaRouche's role with Ronald Reagan, Shultz was an opponent of the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was actually Reagan's most profound attempt to achieve détente with Russia. Later on, after he left the Reagan administration, he went back to Bechtel. He became involved in the Revolution in Military Affairs, which was very much involved in the privatization of military security and intelligence, and which also incorporated the media and especially big tech into the military-industrial complex. This was a policy of U.S. unilateralism, a policy of the permanent war, which was introduced by George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and the group from the Project for a New American Century, based on the idea of unilateralism. Shultz also worked with Baker, James Baker, to promote green ideas. In particular, they supported the 1987 Montreal Protocol, which was involved with supposedly protecting the ozone layer, but which was very important for systematizing inside the government a commitment to green policy. And many of the people we see today parading around as the leading advocates of the Green New Deal in the deep state go back to the Shultz and James Baker grouping. Also, Hank Paulson, later under George W. Bush, was a big part of this. And then after the fall of the Soviet Union, they were very much committed to the shock therapy policy, Shultz in particular, which looted Russia and created a demographic catastrophe for the Russian people. So just to summarize, after the Bretton Woods agreement was broken by Nixon, what was the policy? Anti-science environmentalism, the green idea, floating exchange rate system, which is the speculative swindle which dominates the collapsing global financial system today, based on deregulation, global free trade, outsourcing, deindustrialization, and so on. A radical policy for population reduction. It also included attacks on national sovereignty. There's a famous book written by one of these characters, Walt Wriston of Citicorp, called The Twilight of Sovereignty, in which he argued that because of the shift to artificial intelligence, information technology, and so on, we no longer needed industry. And this is something that was championed by Shultz from his perch at the Hoover Institute at Stanford, this information revolution and so on. So in this sense, Shultz is a midwife for this whole policy which we see emerging today as the Great Reset and the global Green Deal. Now, what stands in the way of this policy? And this will go to answer the question at the beginning, why is there a potential for confrontation between the U.S. and Russia? If the U.S. is brought in as a partner and a muscle man for the Great Reset, then we will be in confrontation with every sovereign nation which wishes to have full economic development along the lines that was laid out by Helga Zepp-LaRouche in her presentation. What this means is that Vladimir Putin would be in contradiction to this Great Reset, as he indicated in the speech at Davos. Well, so is Donald Trump. And interestingly, Russiagate targeted Trump and Putin for regime change. And this is where you see the relationship of the Great Reset. And the reason I went through this history of British geopolitics against Russia, to make the connection to what we've just gone through for the last 4 years in the United States. When you think about who was behind Russiagate, it was the City of London, their intelligence agencies, it was the intelligence community of Obama and Bush, the so-called permanent bureaucracy in the US, the media, now we see the role of the social media. All of them came together to bring down Trump and to initiate this Great Reset. The best way to defeat the Great Reset is to revive this Russian-American historical tradition. Lyndon LaRouche put it this way. He said, we need a four-power agreement centered around the U.S., Russia, China, and India as the most powerful nations when it comes to population, economic potential, and military, to take on the globalization pushed by the City of London and British geopolitics. And that's what the issue is today. And that's why we have to continue this fight to bring the United States into an agreement with these other three powers. And a starting point would be for there to be a final agreement from the United States to meet with President Putin in a special summit, which would include either the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, as Putin proposed a year ago in January, or a coalition of other countries, but to use that as a basis for turning back this anti-science, population reduction, war policy of the war hawks and the neoliberals who answer to the dogma of British imperial geopolitics.
Okay, thank you, Harley. I think we've now resolved our earlier technical problem with Senator Mike Gravel. And again, we'd like to invite him now to give some remarks. I think people heard my introduction before, so I'm not going to try it again. So, Mike, let's see if we can make you out.
Finally, with one voice. I want to use a Senate tradition, and that is to associate myself with the remarks of Helga and Ray McGovern. And I want to congratulate Helga in using her leadership to put together this kind of a roundtable discussion of the issues from various perspectives. My perspective is let me just add that Ray McGovern is our leader. I'm one of the former intelligence officers. I was 24 years old when I was a top secret control officer and the adjutant for the Communications Intelligence Service, which was an entity to wiretap and open people's mail in Europe. And of course, not much has changed. The technology has improved to the point where we can listen to Helga, to the Prime Minister, to the Chancellor Merkel on her telephone. And of course, Americans forget that was more than 10 years ago. And of course, that's where we had this technology that was exposed by Snowden, where we could And we do rake up all of the information of all calls in the world. And so when we make charges against whether it's China or whether it's Russia, these charges are ridiculous. What we've charged that they're doing, we've been doing for more than several decades. And that's where the hypocrisy builds in with the concept that we as a democracy, and of course I don't even believe we're a democracy, but we as a democracy should lead the world. No, we are probably the greatest threat to world peace on the planet today. And Helga really based her comments on the statement of this admiral. Well, I got to tell you, if you pay any attention to what these admirals and generals are saying, it's always the same theme. It's a question of scaring us to death that there's going to be a war, that we're going to be subject to the threat of others, and it's ridiculous. It's the only threat we have is from our own military. I often say that the best way to judge who's at fault or who's leading us astray is just to look at the budgets of the various countries involved. And so Russia, who we treat as a pariah, has a budget of less than 10% of our budget for defense. And of course, it's not for defense, it's for war. And then China has probably about 15% of our budget. And of course, the big scare with China is that they would cause a war in the Pacific. Well, China has every reason to expect and to be involved as an influence in the Far East, because that's where their domain is. We have no domain there other than what we assert with the expansion of our nuclear aircrafts in nuclear. The Nimitz, the Theodore Roosevelt, running up and down the South China Sea, trying to create an incident either with Taiwan, which of course we continue to pour gasoline on that potential fire when there's no reason to. China is obviously prepared to be patient, and in the long run, they feel that Taiwan will be reintegrated as a province of China. And that's to be expected. Of course, with respect to Russia, it's a different situation altogether. We are not a threat to Russia. In fact, I reverse that. We are a threat to Russia. Russia's not a threat to us. Why here? Russia's trying to get an economic leg up by selling its resources into Europe with pipelines, which we oppose and try to sabotage. And then, of course, what we've done with Tehran, which is egregious, totally egregious. And it's very sad right now that our Secretary of State is making the case that, well, we want to get back together but we're not prepared to do it until the Iranians do certain things to lower their potential defense guard, and that's wrong. We're the aggressors. We're the ones that went into destroyed the treaty, our presence in there with the treaty, and then turned around and sanctioned them after we've jumped out of the treaty that was on its way to bring substantial peace. And so now it distresses me no end when we hear the Biden Secretary of State and the administration talk about wanting to renegotiate with Iran renegotiate with them before we do away with the sanctions. Here, we were the bad party in this scenario. So why can't we turn around and say, okay, we'll cut all the sanctions. We're back into the treaty. Now, are there other things we want to deal with? But that's where you start. You don't start by saying, well, we're not going to really get into any diminution of sanctions, which are, of course, wrong, until you turn around and agree to these changes in this agreement and where it will lead us. This is so typical American arrogance with a capital A. And of course, you can look at other facets of here. When the Biden administration, and I was happy with the number of his appointees, but then the Victoria Nuland's name pops up to be a significant person in the foreign policy area. Victoria Nuland is one sick puppy from my point of view. She's the one that started the coup visibly and overtly, using snipers to be able to destabilize the existing government, and then overtly appointed the new person in charge, and was impatient to wait on the ascension to the new person from the EU. And of course, that's when she uttered the famous words, Nuland, fuck the EU, we're going to put in our person without delay. And then, of course, the plan, which, if you're not aware of it, was to turn around and get the crazies installed in Kiev. And those crazies, a lot of them were fascist, a la German fascism and Mussolini's fascism. And they're installed now. They're in charge in some degree or other, and they've gravitated to the defense area involved. And obviously, it was their hope to be able to take over the Crimea and to harass the Sevastopol military installation, which is the most significant military installation that the Russians have. And so Putin really proved his brain power when he decided to use unmarked uniforms and take over the institutions of the Ukraine, and then turned around and had a plebiscite, overwhelmingly the people supporting their participation back in Russia, which of course had been given to the Ukraine by Khrushchev in a gratuitous effort, God knows why. But now you have the what's going on in the eastern part of the Ukraine, the Donbass, where essentially it's a civil war that was initiated by the leadership in Kiev. And so here you hear American media, well, it's all Putin that did all this terrible things, when it was, in point of fact, the intelligence and sophistication that Putin possesses that has kept a lid on the whole thing. I could go into other areas, but we should just take a look at China. Here, China has initiated its economic expansion, which we negate. It's like an entrapment of all these countries, and that is the development of one road, one belt, one road. And so here you have China facing, after their usual accomplishment of bringing 500, 600 million people into economic development, and where they enjoy a level of freedom and prosperity. And I want to put that together. China literally has done more for freedom than we have in the last 100 years. And when China turns around and takes 600 million people and brings them into middle class, what does that mean? Middle class means that you've got a decent wage, you can educate your children, you can have a decent life. That's middle class. Well, we haven't even done anything close to that. And so we regale against China for having done that. Well, China is wrought with many problems, as are we. And I say we because, we have three-fourths of our population are as nutty as fence posts, because they turn around and accept the fact that the election did not take place and that Trump won. I mean, it doesn't get sicker than that in denying reality. But these are Americans. This is the United States of America, which holds itself up morally above others, when in turn of fact, has no right for that position. Now, what One Belt and One Road is doing is realizing that China has an excessive productive capacity after what they did within China. And so they've got to find a way to put that extra productive capacity to work. One, to bring returns to China, and two, to be able to invest it productively around the world. And of course, what they're doing within their own country. Maglev and their railroad is just one example of how they're moving ahead so aggressively and intelligently in the productive capacity of their own country. So China is here. Make a comparison. We turn around and look for agreements where people will buy our weaponry and will follow our leadership in a very immoral fashion, potentially leading to war. China turns around and is trying to make an inroad into the world by turning around and financing economic improvements in countries around the world. They have this One Belt investment program going on in over 140 countries at this point in time. Well, what does that mean? That after they've built these infrastructures and they're run by the people, and if the people of the country don't have this sophistication, they're run by China. This is no big deal, and this doesn't take any genius to figure that out. But the difference between China's lending money and, let's say, the United States through the World Bank and the IMF lending money is that the World Bank and IMF, they hold the people, the citizens, responsible for the loans. And so the government is required to turn around and punish the economic interest of the citizens, impoverish them, and by inflicting pain on them, so that they would lower so that use their tax base to pay off these loans that they've made that the World Bank and the other has made. Now, China's a different situation. What they've done is these are not recourse loans. That means that if you can't pay the loan, it's no big deal. They're not going to force your government to lower your standard of living to pay for the loans. They'll just take over the operation until it becomes profitable and independent, and then obviously turn it back to the people in question. So now make a comparison between the United States and China. They are trying to bring about an economic uplift in the world economy, benefiting the citizens of the world economy, as opposed to what the United States is doing, which is trying to bring about the distribution of military hardware. Now, Helga mentioned this admiral. I've followed the statements at great length of the admirals and generals, and it's horrifying, horrifying. His is just one statement, but you look at them all. You know, we've carved up the world into commands, and in these commands, we monitor what the opposition is doing, which would be either China or Russia, Venezuela, and in this opposition, we set the stage for what Helga's pointed out and others have pointed out, a possible nuclear confrontation. Now, it's more serious than even what they point out, because under Biden, Obama, under not Biden, but Obama, he agreed to the authorization of $1.7 trillion for the expansion of our nuclear capability to increase its explosive threat and to the world. Now, if you look at the problem that we have with nuclear, it all centers around that authorization, where the military establishment of the Pentagon has indicated that this is their number one priority. There's nothing more significant or important to the Pentagon than the expansion of our nuclear capability. Now, all I can say is this is insanity. It's insanity. We'll be spending upwards of $3 or $4 trillion if the track record of the Pentagon is that is to be followed with their excesses. But now, when you're talking about $3 to $4 trillion for nuclear preparedness, now we are one of we're one of 9 states that have nuclear capability. What is the threat of those 9 states? Now, we can take our several trillions of dollars and say, well, that's a big threat. Of course it is. It's the biggest of all. But then you can turn around and you can say, well, what happens if Pakistan and India go to war and have a nuclear exchange? What if Israel and Iran were to have a nuclear exchange? What if the United States, in its craziness, has what they consider a modest nuclear exchange that can be controlled, which of course it can. Now, what happens in any one of those cases is the use of maybe a couple hundred nuclear weapons. A couple hundred nuclear weapons detonated in the world will bring about a nuclear winter, which means it'll bring about the end of our civilization and the end of life on this planet. Now, that's what we're playing with. That's what we're offering in a way of global leadership when we say that we want to have first strike capabilities. And you ask some general or admiral, they'll tell you the reason why we have to have first strike is we want to scare the bejesus out of any country that might even think of attacking us. Well, there's no country, in my mind, that is thinking of attacking us. Now, we may have some rogue powers that will do that as retaliation for the fear and the warmongering and the use of military weapons, particularly the drones. It's the United States, in 10 years from now, when the whole world is all screwed up with everybody using their drones, harken back to the fact that we're the ones that initiated this. And so our drones, again, it's under Obama, where he, of course, was using it wantonly as he looked at his desk over his medal deal. Well, I think you know what I'm trying to say in that regard. I apologize that, going on to 91, that sometimes I don't speak with the clarity that I think I would have in earlier years. But let's really be very clear. It's the United States of America that is the world threat today. And I doubt that we'll bring that under control in any time soon, because there's a cycle, and these admirals and generals, when they retire, they go to cushy jobs on boards of directors, get millions of dollars in additional retirement, in addition to their military retirement, and they go there, and so you have the cycle. The next generation of generals and admirals are getting ready to retire. They're making sure that they're taking care of one or more corporations in the military-industrial complex. And I think it was Ray or somebody else that mentioned that it's not only the military-industrial complex, but the academic think tanks, all the whole group in the United States controlled by these forces. And that's the tragedy. Can we get out of that conundrum? I think not. And of course, at my age, I'm just pessimistic. I still have my hopes that there can be something done intelligently. But when you look at the way capitalism is structured, controlling the elements of economic society, and those elements are dependent upon our nuclear and military capability, then you don't see much of a way out of the process, because we're trapped. One, the military are in bed with the companies that produce the weaponry. The weaponry is used for war, and actual war. It's not just a threat. We see this around the world, and at some point there may well be an accident, and it's it's Murphy's Law. What can go wrong will go wrong. I've recently published a book called Failure of Representative Government and the Solution. The solution is to bring the people into the operation of government. The leadership, when we, our pundits, ourselves included in the group that we're speaking with today, the thought is, well, we're gonna get the right leaders to take us to the right locations of civilization. Well, I'll tell you what, there's no such leader. It hasn't been in the past, and it won't be in the future. The only answer is going to have to come from the people empowered to make laws. Lawmaking is the touchstone of our civilization. And until we have the people learn to make laws where they can overcome the bias that exists in our capitalist system, which is totally flawed and cruel and mean and dysfunctional. So what we need is a change. Change can't take place within the government. They don't want to change. The elites control it, and they're not going to they're not going to dilute their power. And so if we want change, it's going to have to come from the people. But the people don't have the capability to bring about change because they're not in the Constitution. They can't make laws because it's not written in the Constitution. And so we see on close analysis that the major barrier to bringing about fundamental change in the United States is the Constitution itself, which we all revere and pledge to support. Well, we should take a page out of what was really the important document, and that is the Declaration of Independence, where all human beings are created equal, and at the same time to observe that the Constitution enshrines slavery for perpetuity and is part of the problem that we face today. The racism that we experience, and it's fundamental to the American psyche, the racism that we experience today is a product of representative government, is a product of the Constitution of the United States. I say that with great embarrassment as an American citizen. I could go on for some time, but I think I'll close on that. And that is that if there's a hope that that change will be brought about, it has to be a hope that the people will be able to to acquire the main thrust of civilization, and that is lawmaking. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator. And many of us are going to have things to say, including in response to what you said. I think it's important for everybody to, however, realize we're having a cross-generational discussion. You know, like I said before, you were in state government when I was 10 years old. And there are people who remember what the importance of the war in Vietnam was to how they changed their lives to fight against that kind of injustice. At the same time, obviously, over the course of more than a half century, which has now elapsed, there have been a lot of things that have been wrong, and those things need to be addressed. A final speaker today, and I think in part she'll probably respond in part to what she both heard here and overall, is Diane Sare, who was a candidate for, independent candidate, I should say, for United States Senate for 2022, running against Chuck Schumer in New York. So, Diane?
Yeah, thank you very much, Dennis. I have many thoughts, and some things will be addressed, but what I wanted to actually focus on is the question of the American people and the role of the American people in this, because we do have, whatever you want to say, a representative government. And I think, unfortunately, the government is reflective of the American people, although not necessarily in their interests. But I think that many people have somewhat lost sight of what their interest is, or have certain gut reactions which are truthful, perhaps in intent, but not well informed. And that is thanks to a despicable, controlled news media run by people and agencies that Harley was describing involved in this Great Reset. But I wanted to take the case of Bertrand Russell, because LaRouche identified him as perhaps the most evil figure of the 20th century, or 19. He was born in 1872, died in 1970, I think, and was responsible for a number. His outlook, I should say, shaped a lot of the problem we're facing today. One is he, although supposedly a peace activist, thought that as soon as the United States developed nuclear weapons, we should immediately obliterate the Soviet Union to make sure that you would have the capability for a one world government, quote, nominally run by the United States, but really the British Empire reaching its hand through the United States, because clearly this was not in the interest of the United States as it was founded or conceived to be running a global empire. We did not declare our independence in order to replace the British Empire, but to assert in truth that all men are created equal, and I mean all human beings, which was the intent of the nation. So you had Russell, in that regard, calling for preemptive nuclear war. You also had Russell, in his book, The Impact of Science on Society, saying that the number one question for humanity is mass psychology. That is, what would it take to induce children to say that snow is black? And he said we should develop this to such a science that we can figure out exactly how much per pupil it would cost to get them to that point, versus saying that snow is gray. And he said we discovered that the influence of the family is destructive, verses repeatedly intoned to music are very helpful in this regard. In other words, mass brainwashing. So now look at where we are today. What has caused people to, in a sense, not be able to fight in the real world? They have sort of frozen or put in the back of their mind, because I believe that by people, the nature of people being human, they do have a capacity to know whether something is true or not. They can reason it out. That was why Socrates was such a threat. But they've decided to simply freeze that and just accept things, as they say, on face value, or as John Brennan famously said, I don't do evidence. So we have these stories, like the case of Navalny, we're discussing here today, who supposedly Putin, who was formerly a colonel or lieutenant colonel in the KGB, I would imagine therefore rather skilled, knows how to do things, but somehow wasn't smart enough to figure out how to kill him with a deadly poison, and instead allowed him to be moved to a hospital in Germany where he could be treated. Now, how does this story possibly make any sense whatsoever? It doesn't make any sense. It's completely illogical. And why, given the non-support for Navalny in the Russian population, would he be even seen as a threat in the first place? Or we have the story of Assad. You remember President Trump said early on in his term that he was seriously considering withdrawing American troops from Syria. So we're supposed to believe that Assad is such an idiot that the minute he hears that we're going to take, or that he loves having American troops in Syria, maybe that's what we're supposed to believe, that Assad, upon hearing this, decides immediately that he wants to run and use chemical weapons on his own population, even though he hasn't used chemical weapons on ISIS and the rebels who are trying to overthrow him. Again, this makes no sense whatsoever, but you are to suspend judgment and just accept the line that Assad is gassing his own people. Or we hear about the Russians hacking the DNC server and meddling in the elections, and our beloved Senate votes based on no evidence, because none has to be presented. They vote 97-2 to impose sanctions on Russia for meddling in the elections, which they don't require any proof of. And then in 2017, it turns out that Sean Henry of CrowdStrike testifies that they had no evidence whatsoever of exfiltration of data, that is, a hack of the DNC server. And I'll give one last example. Pelosi, who wants so badly to impeach Donald Trump, and then she asserts that she was completely opposed to impeaching Bush, even though she knew that Bush had lied about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, that she knew for a fact that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We went to war against that country, killing over 1 million Iraqis, losing thousands of American lives, untold expense, and refugees, and making a mess of the region. She knew that it was a lie, did nothing about it, and argues that Trump should not be impeached, and frankly doesn't probably think that she should resign over having gone along with that. So I've just given several examples of really whoppers. I mean, things that a 4 or 5-year-old in a sane society would consider laughable, but you have everyone up to the U.S. Senate marching in lockstep to go around with this, and emphatically the American people wanting to be overheard saying these things that are absolutely not true. Now, on this question of the elections, I certainly have questions about the integrity of this election, but we're now at a point where it was all right in 2000, where it dragged on for weeks and weeks after the election to have questions about hanging Chads in Florida and what happened. In 2004, there were very legitimate questions about whether or not Kerry actually won the election, which looks like he may have. That was allowed to be asked. In 2016, there were recounts all over the place where it kept being discovered that Hillary had fewer votes than she thought, but they had recounts. But somehow in 2020, you're not even allowed to ask the question. If you ask the question, you'll have your Twitter account shut down, your Facebook account shut down. And again, no one is allowed to review any of this evidence. And I think part of the danger is a further mind control where you get people to censor themselves. Similarly, I think you're not allowed to say that Russia did not hack the election or did not hack the DNC server. So I think that we have to have respect for our own minds and our own ability that when you hear something, take a step back and actually reason through what you're being told. That Assad, on hearing the U.S. wants to get its troops out of Iraq, would suddenly launch a chemical attack on his own population. It just makes no sense whatsoever. Now I'm going to leave that and just let people think about it. I want to share something from Lyndon LaRouche on the question of the modern nation-state republic, which I really think is very beautiful and gets at a solution to this, because one of the things that forces us into reality is the pandemic, where over 2 million people worldwide have died. We have lost, we're approaching 500,000 deaths in the United States. Turns out last year, apparently, Russia had an excess of 323,000 deaths over the previous year. There's been a massive death toll. This is something people can make up all the stories they want. It's real, and the only way to solve it is real, and not just this disease, but future pandemics, which don't need to be pandemics. There will be future new viruses and new diseases, but if we quickly develop a collaboration among nations to raise the standard of living such that people have modern electricity, running water, good nutrition, transportation, a virus need not become a pandemic. And I think this is an urgent task before us. But from LaRouche, who's talking about the question of the nation state, the development of the nation state versus the previous oligarchical empire. And he says, finally, under the rule of the sovereign form of nation state republic, the place of merely positive law was taken over by the notion of general welfare in the preamble of our Constitution, I might add, which some people like to say is not part of it, but it emphatically is. But I'll go on. A notion interchangeable with the idea of a commonwealth in which the defense and improvement of the conditions of life of all of the people and territory of the nation and its posterity is the standard of accountability by which the truthfulness and truthful justice of the adopted law was and is to be judged. And I think that's a standard which people should take, should internalize, because you can measure what is the life expectancy of the population, what is the infant mortality, what is the literacy rate. There are ways that you can measure if your laws, if your government is having the desired effect for the population. And that's an actual standard of truthfulness, where all of these things that we're told all the time, 97% of scientists say X. Well, you know, very often in history, 97% of people believing in something is exactly the thing that indicates to you that it might be wrong or should be wrong. So I'll leave it at that for now.
All right, so what we're going to do is we want to now bring our whole panel up. I think the best way for us, there's a lot of things that are going to obviously want to be discussed. There's a lot of people, and there are a few questions as well. I think basically most of them are written questions. And if you want to ask a question, we'll put that back up on the screen, questions@schillerinstitute.org. But if we could have, I think, Helga first, if you have any response sort of to everything you've heard, the panoply of what you've heard. And then anybody who would like to say anything at that point, just raise your hand and we'll hear from you. So, Helga?
Well, first of all, I want to thank all of your speeches, because I learned a lot, and it was it's good to know that people like you exist. It makes me happy. So that's the first thing. So secondly, I mean, obviously, what in particular, Mike Ravel, what you were saying about the power of the military-industrial complex, or the MITIMEC, which I like because it puts the whole concept together in a much better way. It's true, but you know, and I know how the military-industrial complex is perceived in the rest of the world, I don't think people have much illusions about what's the difference between being a aircraft carrier for the United States anywhere in the world, having bought all these weapons and being part of these military alliances, or receiving real development from China through the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, the opinion of the majority of the countries in the world is clearly, going in the direction of the development. So there is a dynamic which I think is very real. And, I mean, what you're describing about how these people go from the military to the corporations, making tons of money. Yeah, they make a lot of money, and money obviously buys you a lot of privileges and all of this. But it's a symptom of an oligarchy. And the oligarchy, even if they're entrenched and many and so forth, they're not what is human. It's not creativity. And I would like to counter that with the example of the head of the space agency of the Emirates. I mean, Lynn and I were in Abu Dhabi in 2002 in June, and Lynn was invited to give a speech there on the future of oil. And he made a speech where he emphasized that, people should not think that the oil is something of value. It should not be used as a fossil fuel, that this would be a waste, that there should be much more sophisticated chemical production, and that oil should be used to create fresh water. And, anyway, if you look at the Middle East, they had a high period in history, which was the Abbasid dynasty around the 8th century, when the most advanced science was actually in Baghdad. Harun al-Rashid, al-Mamun, and al-Mansur, these caliphs, they would give gold to anybody who would bring a discovery from Egypt, from Greece, from Spain, because they valued it so much. And it was the most developed area in the world at that point. And then they collapsed and had a very long period of not developing and actually going backwards. And then all of a sudden you have this, in a certain sense, surprise development where a young woman, still being in her scarf and dressed in a Muslim way, but she is out there, she is portraying a sense of genius. And she tells us that the entire team of the Hope mission is average 27 years old.
Oh, all right. So I should just, apparently we have an interruption of Helga's stream. All right. So I guess we should just wait for a minute, see if we can get that corrected. But if there's anybody else that has anything to say, I can just say on my own part, and I'm not supposed to necessarily do that, but since the technical opportunity has come up, that with respect to what particularly Senator Gravel said, and this would be different than what Helga's making as her point, but I'm reminded of something that the Reverend James Bevel, who worked with Dr. Martin Luther King in Selma, Alabama, Birmingham, Alabama, most famously, he used to talk about the U.S. Constitution and the preamble as a prayer. And he said that the idea of we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and ensure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution. He made the point that it was a prayer, and that the concept behind the prayer is that you can't ask God for anything that you're not prepared to deliver for yourself. Now, Bevel might have been a minority of very few in believing that, but the notion of the concept of more perfection, more perfect union, was that people who were imperfect were offering that. and that they were saying that this is something that as a country we are committed to, but as individuals we have to enforce it. So I just wanted to put that in. And Helga, we lost you in transmission, so we were just waiting for you to come back on. And if you
When
would
did
resume.
I drop off?
What was the exact point, Diane? Do you remember?
She was talking about the leader of the space program in the UAE and what Lynn had said at Abu Dhabi.
And you had made
Yeah,
the point that the people were 27 years old was the average age of the program.
yeah. So I wanted to. Did you hear what I said about the Abbasid dynasty?
Yes, that part we got about the 8th century.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I mean, a region which obviously was not developing for a very long time, all of a sudden, or not so sudden, but in a relatively short period of time, you have such a jump, a leapfrogging, being one of the 3 countries with a Mars mission in this month. So there are many geniuses out there potentially, and I think, I mean, that has been the conflict which was first pointed out by Lynn, by Schiller, that there is this fundamental difference between the oligarchy and the potential creativity of the people. So I think the more we work to unleash the creativity of the young people in particular, but people in general, I think there is a point in history where the oligarchical system will collapse and vanish, and that we will reach a renaissance of people, who have the commitment, like in the Declaration of Independence, where the pursuit of happiness for everybody on the planet. And I don't think this is an illusion. I think we are in a historical moment of a change of an epoch, and this Mitimac, in a certain sense, is together with the British royal family. They are the incarnation of the old system, but a new system is definitely emerging.
All right. Anybody else have anything? Alex, sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to take a second to putting on my financial analyst hat. Talking on from what Mrs. LaRouche said, for what Senator Mike Gravel said about the money motivations and incentives, the system of incentives that exist in the military-industrial complex. It is that is all true, but this is also the weakness of the system, because the glue that holds everything together is money, is the U.S. dollar and euro and pound and so forth. But all of these currencies are on the verge of a collapse. So we will have a currency collapse, primarily in the US dollar, but also in the British pound, the euro, Japanese yen, Swiss franc, and so forth. Maybe different time frames. Nobody can predict how fast or how soon this will happen, but it is imminent and it's mathematically unavoidable. So that glue that holds the oligarchy together, that holds the strings together between the political and military power, that feeds the think tanks, the academia, and so forth, that all unravels, and that will create the vacuum that will be important to fill with better ideas, rather than just following the dictate of the same people that have been running this place into the ground for the past 200 years.
Okay, Ray, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, I would just like to repeat my thanks for being included here. I'd also like to glom on to some of the things that my friend Ed Lozansky said. And I think it relates to how we fix all this. Now, I have no illusions that it's easy, but if people learn, for example, the close relationship between Abraham Lincoln and Alexander II, okay? The fact that Alexander II freed the serfs a couple of years before the Emancipation Proclamation, the fact that we were allies during a very, very terrible time during World War II. We talk a lot in this country, in the United States, about passing the 450,000 people dead from COVID-19. And that was more people that we lost in World War II. Americans need to know how many Russians died in World War II. It was 26, 27 million. They don't know that. And we need to fast forward and point out that, even at what I talked about, the acme of recent Russia-U.S. relations, when Mr. Putin pulled Mr. Obama's charcoals or coals out of the fire, okay, on Syria, and made it unnecessary for Obama, as he said later, to follow the Washington playbook and attack Syria openly. Well, people don't know that during that precise time, it happened to be early September 2013, Mr. Putin very candidly cited in an op-ed in the New York Times, what the real problem was. And this is what he said. It's only a couple of sentences. This will improve our recent cooperation on Syria will improve the atmosphere and strengthen mutual trust. Now, I am reliably informed that Mr. Putin penned this last paragraph himself, and confirmation came when spontaneously, in answer to an interviewer's question about half a year ago, he said almost precisely the same thing. Please listen. My working and personal relationship with President Obama is marked by growing trust. I would rather disagree, though, with the case he makes on American exceptionalism, saying that what makes America different is what makes America exceptional. It is extremely dangerous to encourage people to see themselves as exceptional. There are big countries, small countries, rich and poor, those with long democratic traditions and those still finding their way to democracy. We are all different. But when we ask for the Lord's blessings, we must not forget that God created us all equal. Wow, that sounds like the Declaration of Independence, actually. Now, if people realize that pretending to be the sole exceptional country in the world is not only dumb, but it's mischievous. When people are asked, for example, as I ask graduate students, they say, well, now, okay, what does it mean to be exceptional? Do you guys know what a synonym is? What would be a synonym for exceptional? And they say, well, it's exceptional. What would be an antonym? Well, an antonym, that would be an opposite word. That would be not exceptional, just kind of ordinary, not indispensable, but is this right? Dispensable. So if the U.S. is the sole indispensable country in the world, like Madeleine Albright and others say, well, what does that mean for the other countries? And the students will kind of stroke their chins. Oh, well, I guess that means that they're dispensable? Well, yeah. That's what Putin is saying here. And what I'm saying is that Biden has a unique chance to get off that pony, okay? To say, look, we're going to deal with people kind of on an equal basis. Now, he's got to do that with good rhetoric, but John Kennedy tried it, and it worked to an extent before they killed him. Now, Biden's almost as old as I am. Maybe he'll be less chary about doing constructive things vis-a-vis Russia, where we have no ancient enmity or hate, but rather a artificially contrived, a kind of artificial enmity that helps build, sell arms, stuff Congress people's pockets, and make the military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, think tank, academia complex so powerful.
Okay, Harley, you've had your hand up a few times.
Yeah, I'd like to say something in relationship to what Alex said on the financial system and also on what Ray is saying about the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex was never meant simply as military or defense-related, but it includes, at this point, it's grown to include consultants, advisory firms, construction firms, and then beyond that, as he pointed out, the media, the academic world, think tanks, and so on. But what are they supporting? What's the policy of the military-industrial complex? It's neoliberal economics. That's indisputable. That's what the idea of an empire is all about, that you have free trade so the powerful can take advantage of the weak. What happens when the weak start to resist that? Well, we saw it with what happened, the targeting of Iraq, the targeting of Libya, the targeting of these countries because they were looking for a way out of an economic system defined by a unilateral power of financial interests. Now, those, as Alex said, those financial interests are in deep trouble. So what are they trying to do? They're trying to put a happy face on it by talking about the Great Reset. But the Great Reset is an attack on the not just sovereign nations, but the people of the world. It's essentially saying that central banks and their technical experts will decide spending policy as well as monetary policy. This is why I brought up the question of shock, and this is what Lyndon LaRouche always came back to, that to the extent you have an imperial force that's defending private interests as opposed to the general welfare, then you're going to have a conflict in society. Now, the good news about this is that they're very stupid, they're very weak, their system won't work. We already see a level of internecine warfare among the establishment. Who's going to get the $30 trillion they're talking about in funny money pumped out by the central banks? And on top of that, the populations are being oppressed by the effects of their policies. So when we talk about the military-industrial complex, what we have to look at is this bigger picture of a collapsing economy, but also what is the antidote to that? And that's what LaRouche devoted his life to, the idea of the American system. And as Helga pointed out, the way the American system, or an element, an idea of the American system, is being implemented by the Chinese government with its economic policies, with the emphasis on physical economy as opposed to speculative financial instruments. So that's why we have an opportunity now, but it's going to require understanding who the real enemy is, who's calling the shots, and how to outflank them. That's why a simple policy that LaRouche came up with as the first of his 4 laws, Glass-Steagall, would be so effective. You essentially create a regulatory system that puts speculators who are bankrupt through bankruptcy reorganization rather than bailing them out. So these are the kinds of ideas that we have to come up with as the flanks, which would be in the interest not just of the American people, but also the German people, the Italian people, the continent of Africa, as well as, of course, Russia.
Okay, so we have several other matters. We have a person who's been waiting patiently on Zoom, and we have a couple of questions which I believe that Diane has, which are texted to us. And before we go to those, I'm going to play something for everybody, which is a short video from, as a member from the European Parliament, Claire Daly, an Irish politician. She's been in the Parliament, I think, there since 2019. She represents Dublin. She's a member of the Independence for Change. We're just going to show this and get a response from the panel on what you are hearing.
Ms. Daly, for 1 minute.
And listening to the relentless Russia-phobia in this place, why are people surprised that Russia sees no point in engaging with the EU? I'm as happy as anybody else to stand up for anybody's rights, including Navalny's. But let's be honest about him. He's a vicious, anti-immigrant racist on maybe 4% of the support. in rallying hundreds and thousands in cities of millions, hardly a mass movement. And we wouldn't be discussing him at all if he'd been arrested anywhere else other than in Russia. Meanwhile, Julian Assange has been incarcerated for almost 10 years for exposing US war crimes. We can't mention his name. Tomorrow, Pablo Hasél, a Catalan rapper, is going to prison for his lyrics. Where's the call to sanction Spain? Tomorrow, 62-year-old Claire Grady is going to prison in West Virginia for her role in the non-violent ploughshare action against Trident. Where's the demand to break off links with the US, or the outcry about the hundreds of people arrested in this city on a protest a week ago? Nowhere, because this isn't about human rights. This is a geopolitical agenda against Russia, fueled by a military-industrial complex who need an enemy to justify their millions. Of course you're right to go to Russia. We should be engaged in dialogue, not war.
All right. So first, is there anyone who'd like to respond or has anything to say about what you just seen?
Bravo.
Okay, so that we got that from Mike. If not, what we'll do is we'll go to the phones for I think that's Andrew who's on the phone, who works with Action with Assange. And if we can bring him up, Dave, so we can hear what he has to say. And then, do we have him? It always takes a bit to switch over, I guess, from Zoom. We're not. Dave, we're not hearing him. Okay,
hello?
You want to work? Yes, hello. Andrew, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you guys.
Okay, great. We don't have a visual on you at the moment, but why don't you just go ahead if you had either a question or a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to start by saying thank you for allowing me to come on and talk. But I did want to start out with a bit of a question, because there's been, and obviously, growing tensions with war between America and Russia and America and China. And I believe a large part of it has to do with a media environment that doesn't actually allow conversations to be facilitated. So I guess the question I could put up to the panel is, do you think that there's any hope of building an international order starting with, or I guess institutions starting with the idea of just allowing a free press, like where America, Russia, and China can come together to have that be a starting point and then grow from there?
Okay, so that's directed at the panel. Okay, Helga?
I only read a headline today that India is developing its own internet and own social media independent of the high-tech Silicon Valley networks. So maybe that's the way how things will play out. I think there is a growing awareness of the absolutely unbelievable double standard. I mean, I could make a list of 100 examples where, demonstrations in one country are freedom fighters, and in the same way, in the next one are domestic terrorists. So, it's so absolutely out of order that I think a lot of people start to realize that. But I don't necessarily think that the media will be maybe it will be also a way of developing such an order. But I think that the most promising right now is if one addresses the pandemic, because the developing countries are in a terrible condition. I mean, in Africa, for example, the death rates are much higher than reported because there is simply no testing, and the health system was in much worse shape even before the pandemic started. Among the doctors, we have seen a new development of collaboration, of exchanging knowledge about what to do about the COVID-19 in what phase. And I have, created this or called for this emergence of this committee of coincidence of opposites, of people from the health sector, the farming, of people who are, not party linked, not linked to any particular interest, but who are sharing a mission. And I think this mission orientation is what will get us out of this mess, because if people start to go away from their personal want and desire into, what is required to get the human species out of this incredible crisis. And as I said earlier, I think that the idea that we need a modern health system, modern medical equipment, modern educated health personnel in every single country. And you can already see that the Chinese are talking about the health Silk Road. There is a huge, people accuse China of making vaccine diplomacy, while the countries which are on the receiving end don't have anything against that, because they rather have health vaccine diplomacy or mask diplomacy or whatever than not. So the point I'm trying to make is, I think we have to shift to helping to solve the most pressing issue, which is the world health crisis, the world hunger crisis, the poverty. And I think that can become the unifying spirit, how we can bridge, seemingly unsurmountable differences between the different countries, the different groups. So I would think that is, in my view, the most promising, if people start to become loving and to become empathic, or feel empathy, that is the way how we will change and get to the new paradigm.
Okay. Any follow up on that, Alex or Andrew? I'm sorry.
No, I agree with a lot of what you said there. And I think a very important part of that is having just open access to information, because that's how a lot of these situations can be solved, is by empowering people and communities to make informed decisions instead of propagandized ones.
Okay. Yeah, Ray, go ahead, and then we'll go to you, Diane, with one of the questions. So Ray, go ahead.
No, I think, as usual, Helga's put her finger on it. This is an unusual opportunity to cooperate, not only to contend or be in rivalry with. I want to address a question to Andrew, with whom I've spoken many times in Zoom calls having to do with trying to help Julian Assange. Now, Andrew, you know why it is that I look so disheveled and so unruly. You don't look much better. Do you have a better excuse than I do?
I have the same excuse, actually. A few, probably 18 months or so ago, when we had first got together in a Zoom meeting to talk, you had talked about how you had started the Beards for Assange movement, and that you had decided to grow your facial hair in a way that was resembling Julian's when he was taken out of the embassy. Because a part of his story that a lot of people don't know, leading up to the time that Julian was taken from the Ecuadorian embassy to Belmarsh prison in the UK, the forces there, whether it be UC Global or the embassy staff themselves, went as far as to take Julian's razors away. So that way, when he got taken out, he looked disheveled and looked like he was in tatters almost. So Ray had the idea of growing out facial hair in support and solidarity with Julian for the way that they made him appear. So myself and one of my colleagues, Steve Poikinen, that I do my show with, my podcast, Action for Assange, has also taken up that standard as well. So I really appreciate Ray for the personal invitation for something I wanted to do anyways.
There weren't many takers.
Helga.
Let me ask Andrew, what is the condition of Julian Assange right now? What do you think about the Biden request for the extradition, and what do you think we should do?
Well, to start that, one of the things that we do on our show is at the beginning of every episode, we present the lengths of time since certain things have happened. So it's been 3,717 days since the illegal and arbitrary detention of Julian Assange has started. It is 672 days since Julian Assange was trafficked from the Ecuadorian embassy to Belmarsh prison following a $4.2 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund to the nation of Ecuador. It's been 38 days since Magistrate Vanessa Baratzer denied Julian Assange bail after ruling no extradition and personally ordering his release from prison on January 4th, based solely on the conditions of the U.S. prison system and accepting all U.S. arguments that the U.S. has international jurisdiction over what can and can't be published in the press. I think raising awareness about it, for starters, is one of the most important, but right now, Julian's condition remains unchanged. On January 6th, he was denied bail, and since then has remained in Belmarsh prison. The United States, I believe yesterday, the 12th, has officially formally filed its appeals process, but I haven't seen any paperwork for it yet, but it is now actually there. And in court in January, the judge, and this is the first time I've heard anything like this in my life, on January 6th, while denying Julian bail, specifically cited fairness to the United States, that they would get to appeal, that Julian may abscond or seek asylum from political persecution, so they have to keep him in Belmarsh prison. I don't know of any other time in human history that fairness to a nation state was cited as a reason to continue torture. But that's the situation that we're in now. There was a group, a bunch of different groups, Amnesty International, Reporters Without Borders, I believe the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and a bunch of others that sent an open letter to the Department of Justice demanding that all charges be dropped against Julian. And the Biden administration's response was to file the appeal. So that's the state of where Julian's situation lies right now.
Okay. Well, we'll of course stay posted on that. We'll probably have a chance to readdress it as we get to wind-up remarks. So thanks a lot, Andrew, for that. Diane, you have a written question.
Yes, it says this is from a former member of the National Security Council with expertise in the Middle East and Iran, who writes, while the entire Middle East region is in deep crisis stirred by the old demons of geopolitics, there is a new potential for a solution. It requires vision of the kind Mr. LaRouche had and which still inspires some of us. There is no solution to any one of the crises, such as with the Palestinians, in Syria, in Iraq, or in Yemen. There is only a global solution that respects sovereignty and the uniqueness of this cradle of all civilizations, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and Persian, and recognized the contributions of all of these to mankind. What is needed now is a renewal of the dialogue of civilizations and a revival of Mr. LaRouche's Oasis plan. This is how you counter Anglo-American geopolitics that would divide us and slaughter people in walls. We must put the Oasis plan on the agenda for immediate action. The glorious achievement of the Emirates' Hope Mars orbiter points us to the right pathway to peace based on scientific cooperation and development. Would you comment?
I fully endorse this idea, and we should really put a lot of effort in it. I mean, first of all, in Abu Dhabi, or rather close to it, in the Emirates, there is an island which used to be a complete desert, and when we were there, this was about 20 years earlier, they had started to water it. And now you had older vegetation, younger vegetation, and a complete beautiful garden and wood and whatnot. And all the birds who travel from Europe to Africa in the wintertime, they have now picked that island to stop over because they have such an incredible wealth of food and water there. In any case, the Oasis plan, does have the potential to completely transform this entire region, this entire strip of desert, which goes from the Atlantic in Africa through the Sahara, all the way through the Saudi Peninsula, through the Iraq, Iran, all the way to China, and that is expanding right now. So with all the potentials of peaceful nuclear energy and small modular reactors, you could start to have an enormous amount of ocean waters desalinated. There are new methods of creating water from the ionization of the atmosphere. You can make new rain patterns. So all of this is absolutely on the horizon. And I think that spirit is already there. For example, between China and Iraq, they have now this oil for technology deal. Some of our members have been very instrumental in in proposing these ideas. We have a whole, I just full-heartedly endorse your proposal, and we will push it, with great energy. And I ask you to help us doing that, and let's talk more about it. But I fully think this is the right moment to create that kind of a change.
Okay, very good. Diane, why don't you go to the second question? And if anybody has a response to that, we'll ask you to do that. I think we'll try for the second one now.
All right, this question comes from Joe Hoft of the Gateway Pundit, also recently banned from Twitter. He writes, after the Capitol riots, Hillary Clinton suggested that President Trump might have been on the phone with Vladimir Putin during the riots and called for a 9/11 commission to investigate. Pelosi agreed, saying that these riots were a gift to Putin and the rioters were Putin's puppets, and that with Trump, all roads lead to Putin. The discussion between Hillary Clinton and Nancy Pelosi was on the blog You and Me Both. Similarly, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee stated that if President Trump was not removed under the 25th Amendment, she would call for impeachment. Her first three reasons for impeachment all contend that President Trump should be impeached again for his supposed involvement with Russia. While Hillary Clinton's discussion with Pelosi blaming Putin for the riots may seem bizarre, there are now new developments in which certain Ukrainian Nazis who have been involved in destabilizations in Ukraine have been identified as being present in the riots at the Capitol, and their identification has been reported as involvement of Russians. One photographed participant is Ukrainian Sergei Dubinin, who has been shown in photos with the so-called shaman demonstrator with the horns, Chansley. This Sergei Dubinin is a member of a fascist group called the Zibo Banderites and is in the Ukrainian army. Another prominent member of the Zibo Banderite group, Ukrainian oligarch Ihor Kolomoisky, who owns the TV channel 1+1, published footage from the Capitol riots and claimed that what was shown was Russian involvement in the riots. The photos of these demonstrators and their identification has been published on the Gateway Pundit. Can you comment on these reports, and in particular on the continued narrative by Hillary Clinton and her network in trying to implicate Putin and the Russian government in the January 6th attacks in the United States? Do you have any comments of the links between Antifa, the Banderistas from Ukraine, and the Maidan riots, and intelligence-linked operations, including the FBI, as a kind of international deployable force for colored revolutions? And finally, Democrats involved in the Maidan riots in Ukraine, including President Biden himself, Senator Murphy from Connecticut, and others, have prominent positions in the new administration. It is said that Victoria Nuland, who handed out cookies to rioters in Ukraine, may be given the number 3 position in the incoming State Department. Can you please comment?
Okay, that's quite a bit. Who'd like to go first? I see Ray's got his hand up. Harley, no, Ray, go ahead.
Am I unmuted?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, my first advice is to keep all cookies away from Victoria Nuland. But even more important, I would suggest we do everything possible to keep her from being confirmed as number 3 in the State Department. She's, well, I have a lot of adjectives that I'm tempted to use, but I won't. Now, in terms of Hillary Clinton, we know because the Director of National Intelligence told us that the CIA had a report. It was a Russian study, and it was dated July 26, 2016. And it reported that Hillary Clinton, at the advice of one of her advisors, had said, let's blame this whole thing. Let's blame Russia for everything, okay? She didn't know that she was going to lose. That will come in handy later. But let's blame Russia and say that well, why don't we say that all roads lead to Putin and that everyone is in Putin's pocket, especially Trump, okay? That was the 26th of July, 2016. Front page, New York Times. Next day, David Sanger of WMD fame says the Russians did it, the Russians did it, the Russians did it even before anybody else does, okay? Same day, okay? Now, why would the CIA brief the president on that and then file a report with the Department of Justice to look into it? Well, a few people know this, but there is a process when there's a leak. When somebody leaks something to the press or somebody makes it public, there is a crimes report that is filed, and then you have to look into it. You have to refer it to the Department of Justice. So as I reconstruct it, there was somebody with a conscience within the CIA who said, well, I can't tell the world that Hillary Clinton is making this all up, but let's leak this little Russian report, okay? Let's leak it to, let's see, David Sanger would run with it, okay? So Hillary has been behind us all along. And of course, when she lost, she needed some way to explain why she lost, and you know why. It was the Russians. So I want to put this, I hope that you can see this. Can you read this?
Yes. Yes, we're
Okay.
able to see it.
All right, you may not have seen this before, but there are 2 dogs here, and one says, we're glad you're home. The Russians pooped in the hallway, okay? It's reached ridiculous lengths when Hillary Clinton is talking to the Speaker of the House, mind you, and saying, you know, I'd like to have the telephone conversations that Putin was on with Trump during the riots on January 6th. Boy, I'd love to have them. Let's get them. And Pelosi says, well, yeah, we all roads lead to Putin. We need a 9/11 investigation. I mean, how ridiculous is that? And I'll just come back lastly to the thought that put yourself in Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin's place. Peskov and others have told him about this. I mean, not only does he have to scratch his head, but he's got to say, what does this mean? This means that we're being treated like the Jews were in the 30s before World War II. That means something to any Russian. As I said before, 26 million lost at the hands of the Nazis. So this means something, and unless we get off this kick, unless somebody says, Hillary, nobody's going to take you seriously anymore, then we've got a problem. The problem, of course, the question is, does Hillary still run the Democratic Party or does Joe Biden? Now, my hope is that it's Biden and that he has a degree of maneuverability here. Witness the fact, and this is the last thing I'll say, you know, he could have said, oh, the Russians are paying bounties for U.S. soldiers being killed in Afghanistan. He could have said, Navalny is really, really terrible. He didn't. He let his spokespeople say some things like that. But what did Biden avoid doing? He avoided doing all that kind of stuff. And what did he do? He said, I have a director of national intelligence. Her name is April Haines. I have tasked her to look into bounties for U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan, Navalny, Russian hacking in 2020 and 2016, and she is going to report back to me. Now, is it Pollyanna to hope that there's some measure of conscience in April Haines, the director of national intelligence, and that just say, hey, let's do it the old way. Let's give it to the president straight. If so, it'll come out in the wash that all these things are Hillary Clinton and like-minded people, yerunda, as the Russians would say, crazy stuff. And then, you know, then Biden will have some more room for maneuver. So call me an optimist. I see a glass half full in this respect.
Okay. Does anybody else have anything to say?
Yeah.
Harley, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to raise a question with you then, Ray, because the idea of April Haines having a conscience when she was the one who drafted a memo for John Brennan to justify the Brennan-Obama drone strike meetings on Tuesdays, I find it a little hard to assume that she might actually come up with an honest assessment. But I think it's worth looking at another aspect of this. The whole Russia story, it still hasn't come out. We do know that from work of your associate, Bill Binney, and others from the VIPs, that there was no Russian hack of the Democratic Party computers, Hillary's computers, and so on. We know that even before Hillary said anything about this, Robert Hannigan from GCHQ came to meet with Brennan to say that the British had discovered a Russian intent, what you might call a malign intent, to interfere in the US elections. And we know the whole role of Christopher Steele, who, by the way, was also very prominent in Ukraine in 2014 at the same time Victoria Nuland was handing out her cookies. And he was working with Jonathan Weiner of John Kerry's staff to make sure his assessments of the Ukraine situation got to Nuland and to Kerry and to the US. So there are all these intertwined connections between some of the Biden appointees, as well as the old Obama team, Susan Rice and others, with Christopher Steele, Sir Richard Dearloffe, who was one of the people who provided the lies that became the basis for the Iraq invasion in 2003. So I'm not saying don't be hopeful that something can change, but we have to do something to make sure the full story gets out, because it never did. The full story of Russiagate has never gotten out. And that's the role of the Five Eyes working together, which includes the United States intelligence community, to undermine a president whose biggest crime before coming into office was saying that he wanted to make friends with Putin and have a friendly, cooperative relationship. So I just wanted to add that as a footnote to what you said.
Well, Harley could answer you. You know, I'm talking about a glass half full.
Yeah.
And the reason I consider it half full is because we have a new administration in town. Now, granted, Nuland may be confirmed. Granted that April Haines has a terrible record to defend. But there's a new guy who's giving her orders. Now, let's say April Haines is told, look, Joe Biden, I'm interested. It doesn't really make a lot of sense, this bounty story. And I understand that the intelligence community and the chief military general out there have already debunked it. What's the story on that, April? And this Navalny thing, is it true that he's a racist thug and accounts for 4% or maybe just 1% of popularity? Give me the real facts on that. Now, all I'm saying is, yeah, the odds are against that. But Biden knew these things happen. I've seen changes administrations more than I'd like to admit. And if he's feeling like, I can do things that no other first-term president can do, and maybe he'll seek the truth. And if that's so, and he's already created some leeway for himself, there's no reason why he couldn't work out more, for example, arms control agreements with the Russians. That's my position.
Okay. All right. Mike wants to say something, and then Diane, you have one more question. Is that right? Okay, good. Go ahead, Mike. Go right ahead.
The only thing I wanted to add is we really have to accept the fact that we've always been blaming Russia, whether it's the Soviet Union or Russia, that they are the enemy. They are the ones that are doing all of the malfeasance that's going on in the world. So the chance that a president, whether it's Biden or anybody else, can reverse that, I think is somewhat remote. It's too deeply ingrained by the American military, which is served by the media. And keep in mind that it's the media controlled by the military-industrial complex. And so it's going to be negative on Russia, when in point of fact, there won't, in my mind, there won't be a legitimate investigation of the veracity of the charges against Russia.
Okay. So Diane, you have I think this will be probably our final question, and then we'll probably go to summary remarks for different people, different things. Go ahead.
Okay, good. Yeah, I should say there's many questions, but because of time, we can't get to them all. This is for Senator Gravel. The person writes, you have very direct experience with U.S. elections, not only from your experience in the Senate, but particularly from your presidential campaign. Can you give us advice in shifting the control of elections from the parties, the media, the intelligence agencies back to the voters? What are the implications in allowing the idea of self-government to disappear in the United States?
The implications are very, very serious and would really take the halter off of our war-making capability. With respect to the conduct of elections, they've always been designed for one party to take over the other. And what we've seen is the Republican Party over the last 30, 40 years have done nothing but increase the suppression of voting. We Americans say that our bona fides rest on the fact that we allow people to vote. Well, that's factual. We allow people to vote, but we allow them to vote in a certain way, and that's called voter suppression. When you see an election where people stand in line for 7, 8 hours in order to vote, do you think that by any stretch of the imagination this is a free society? No. And so elections, we've got to take the elections out of the hands of the people, the governments that usurp these elections in order to maintain their power. Here I go back to the simple thesis that the people have to become lawmakers. And it's difficult for people to accept that. But the center of human society and civilization is law, our respect for the law. And so when we see the existing leaders of the world, regardless of who they are, usurping this concept of law that everybody are required to obey, then we have to realize that there's something very wrong. And we can start by looking at the United States and go from there.
Okay, very good. So we're pretty much at the end of time, not meaning people have to rush, but I just want to give people now an opportunity to make whatever summary, both observations and remarks they'd like, and then we're going to close out. So I think I should probably begin with you, Alex. Something you have that you'd like to say to us? You're muted.
Yes, sorry, I muted myself. I apologize. Well, first of all, thank you again for having me, and I apologize for being a little bit distracted. I have my children here, and they got hungry. I had to actually make a meal while we were having this discussion. I think that what I think is very important is for us to understand who the enemy is. I think it's also important to understand the mechanics of their power, which is the nature of money and credit. And so already 145 years ago, Lord Acton warned us that the issue that has swept down the centuries and that would have to be fought sooner or later was the people against the bankers. And this really, in my view, is the conflict between the bankers and the people, because the bankers are the ultimate stakeholders in the empire, whether we call it the British Empire or whatever we call it. They are the ultimate stakeholders of this juggernaut. I think that we can be optimistic because I think for the first time ever, humanity has unprecedented access to information. We literally can understand the nature of money and credit. We can understand the global geopolitics better than we ever have. I think it goes beyond just standing on the shoulders of giants. I think it's an actual people researching, learning, finding out. We're not just standing on the shoulders of giants, we're actually climbing on top of one another. I believe it's a virtual blossoming of humanity. And I mentioned the Confucius metaphor of the seeds growing in silence. I think that could be literally true in some way. And the thing with seeds is that you cannot tell by looking at the seed what it might grow into. But we do know that seeds are the product of nature, and nature always creates very beautiful things. So we can be optimistic about the future of humanity. However, I do suspect that none of us really truly understand what true emancipation and freedom really is. I recently saw a stunning video of a bear pacing in a small circle in the forest. So that bear was rescued after 20 years of captivity in a Romanian with the Romanian circus troupe. And he spent most of his days in a small cage where he just paced in circles. He was rescued. He was led into a large chunk of the forest, but in this forest he continued pacing in a small circle. So I expect that this struggle will be multi-generational because we don't really understand entirely where we're going. But I think that we should probably exert ourselves every day and encourage those around us to exert themselves every day to understand the truth, to research the truth, to communicate it and spread it, and then to simply put faith that we are, we belong here, this place is our birthright, and that we will grow into something beautiful, and not just cheap labor force and cattle for the empire builders on the London Wall Street axis.
Thank you, Alex. Diane?
Well, I again was reminded of how much I was struck by a speech that Xi Jinping gave to younger people in China on the century of humiliation. And he spoke about the opium wars, the Japanese bombing of civilian centers, etc., and said, never again will we allow ourselves to be humiliated in this way. And that was not a threat of violence or force, but a recognition that when we find ourselves degraded, that we usually have some participation in it. And he also said that we will vow that we will never impose conditions of humiliation on anybody else, given what we've learned. And I think we should take that personally, because people have a peculiar conception of what freedom is. And I think if you look to our Declaration of Independence and consider the idea of what might actually be meant by the pursuit of happiness, what gives us profound happiness is knowing that we've had the opportunity to contribute something enduring that lives beyond us. And that would require a human race to exist and to be better than we are. So I think this is what we each have to really honestly look within ourselves and then act to ensure that that comes into existence. And I think we have a moment that is very ripe in potential, but I think also very dangerous, because this rotten old paradigm, which is totally bankrupt, is, speaking of bears, is a little like an injured bear, and in their desperation are prepared clearly to do extremely wild and dangerous things. So we shouldn't underestimate that. That's what I have to say.
Okay, Ray?
Well, again, thank you. I would like to refer to my cousin Claire Daly. Claire Daly, whom you saw speak. She's a distant cousin, but we're from the same sod. And I want to say a few things about her. She's a friend. Now, what was the point of her talk? It was before the EU, by the way, EU Parliament, where she is a delegate. And she was saying, go to Russia, talk to them. One of the top leaders of the EU was about to go to Russia to talk with Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, and there was some consternation as to whether he should go. She said, go there, of course go there. Now, what happened when he got there? The Russian government expelled diplomats from 3 European countries, and they took a pretty hard line on the EU, saying, you people are just kind of vassals of the United States. And so when he got back, he got all kinds of trouble. Now, what's important about Claire Daly is that she and other courageous European politicians know about the Noah principle and act on it. For those of you who don't know the Noah principle, it is this: no more awards for predicting rain, awards only for building arks. Now, we each have to figure out how to build our own arks. Claire has to go to court for action, building an ark against U.S. troops coming through an ostensibly neutral country. The airport was Shannon. I was actually there when 2 of my colleagues went out onto the tarmac and had to spend the next 8 months in Dublin in prison. I didn't, in at least in captivity, I was not caught in that. So the last thing I'll say is, look, we have to do action as well as intellectual statements. And the last thing, I just would say that if there's hope, the notion that in the American system, 60% of the tax money that I pay goes to rich people profiteering on weapons that don't work. When that becomes in the consciousness of the lower 90%, things are going to have to change if people are educated in the right way. And what's going to change? Well, the people lying in the ditch with no blanket nor sheet. Let me tell you the last thing, a little stanza from Tom Moore's poem, The Irish Poet, about the Vale of Avoca, which is a great little place where two rivers meet. Vale of Avoca, where the bright waters meet. There's not in this wide world a valley so sweet as the Vale of Avoca, where the bright waters meet. But if you're lying in the ditch with nor blanket nor sheet, you won't give a damn where the bright waters meet. Well, those last two lines are from my Irish grandmother, okay? But the people lying in this country with nor blanket nor sheet won't give a damn what they hear from Washington once it becomes really desperate. And the coming months may be that crucible. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Okay, Harley?
Well, I'd like to go back to something Ray brought up about the sacrifice made by the Russian people in World War II, which, as he correctly pointed out, very few Americans are aware of that. And I think that's deliberately so. And it gets to a deeper point that I think is an important underlying issue that we have to address, which is the way that the fear of the stranger is manipulated to create an enemy image. And that was done for 4 straight years with Russiagate, targeting the Russians, targeting the Trump election in 2016, by people like Hillary Clinton, who should know better. And I think it comes back to something that has been stated by almost everyone, that we have to find within ourselves the ability to have empathy with other people's struggles, whether it's the children in Africa who have no clean water, whether it's people in the United States who, as Ray just said, lack a blanket or a sheet. But that's what our fight is about, for those of us who do have an ability to speak on these issues, to speak clearly and forcefully, and to encourage everyone else to participate in this fight, because a republic only survives if its people participate. And unfortunately, most of the last period since the assassination of John F. Kennedy, we've seen, for the most part, a drop in the numbers of people who participate. And it turned around a little bit this year. We've got to make sure it becomes overwhelming and that people are given the information and the ideas and the knowledge they need and the spark of creativity and inspiration, so they'll take their place on the stage of history.
Okay, thank you, Harley. Senator Gravel, any last remarks?
I know I many times sound very pessimistic, and I see the world in those kind of problems. But I want to say optimistically, I think we're the luckiest people in the world right now by the fact that we have a leader like Putin in Russia and Xi Jinping in China, who can offer restraint to the unrestrained imperialism of the American leadership. We're lucky that we have these sophisticated people on the other side who are handling the issue, in my mind, in a very intelligent fashion. Thank you. And thank you, Helga, for putting this together.
Thank you, sir. Helga?
Well, I would like to say both pessimistic and optimistic things at the same time. The pessimistic side is that I think we are in a very, very dangerous situation. And, you know, what Alex, you said about how things can change overnight from, you know, nobody expects a war to all of a sudden, you know, you have a completely different dynamic. This was true for World War I, for sure. You mentioned it for the war in Yugoslavia. And I think that is a very big danger. So I would really urge people not to be complacent and get this message out, because I find that most people are not aware how risky the situation is. And the more you look into the potential for an accidental, something going completely haywire. I mentioned the almost collisions over the Black Sea at the Norwegian border. So I just want to really make that point and also encourage people to read two things. One of Putin wrote this very lengthy article about the prehistory of World War II, which has the demand in it that all the archives must be opened of all countries so that people can actually study how the war came about and how the oligarchy was planning it for a long time before. And I think this particular article by Putin is very useful because people have to study the prehistory of wars to understand that what you see on a daily basis is just the tip of the iceberg, but what the intelligence services and the diplomats and the different business interests are doing is many times much more important. So I think that to make people more intelligent, they should read that and look at the Storm over Asia tape of Lynn, which was absolutely prescient. And, I think that is, let's say, on the negative side. On the positive side, well, I think that the good thing is that nature is not just bears, but, also human beings. And I think the human mind has a unique capability to create completely new things. And, in a certain sense, the entire work of Lynn speaks to that, and I think that the fundamental optimism that the human mind can overcome any kind of problem, and that to talk with Leibniz, that every evil brings forward an even greater good. I think that that's also extremely true. And as Lynn always pointed out, most people think that the human mind or the human being is something outside of nature. The greenies even think that human beings are parasites hurting Mother Earth. But in reality, the human creativity is the most important integral part of the physical universe. So whatever we think in our mind has correspondence in the laws of the universe, because if that would not be so, we could never make an invention, because when we make an invention of a new physical principle, this is an immaterial idea, but it works because it corresponds to the laws of the physical universe. So there is a higher lawfulness which we can tap into. I mean, this was called in European philosophy natural law. It has been dealt with in poetry many times in the beautiful poem by Schiller, Columbus, which I can't unfortunately now recite, but it's the idea that what the human mind conceives does find an echo in nature and in the universe. And it's also naturally in the beautiful poem by Schiller about the cranes of Ibycus that, the murderer is revealing himself, because that when the murderer is confronted with that higher power, he has no more control and he reveals himself, and justice can be brought on. So therefore, let's be both vigilant but also courageous and optimistic.
All right. I want to thank Alex Craner, Ray McGovern. I want to thank Diane Sayre, Harley Schlanger, and Mike Gravel for being with us. Obviously, Helga Zepp-LaRouche convened this today. We also want to thank, of course, Dr. Ed Lazansky for what he had to say. But she convened this in order that we begin a process that's actually being suppressed internationally, but we intend to go ahead with, which is a dialogue among people, public fora that allow citizens who watch these and are engaged by them to hear things that will otherwise never be available to them. That's what we've just done here. I think that is sort of in part in response to Andrew, the thing we can do. I think that's the intent of what we did here today. And I think that it was well delivered by everyone. I want to just encourage that everybody that's watching, make sure other people see this. Get this out to people. If you enjoyed this, please respond to us and let us know by letter and so on. If you have a question that you wanted anybody on the panel to answer, let us know about that. I also certainly would invite everybody who participated to, in any way that we can help you get this out to other people. If you've got networks and so on, let us know. And I think we should obviously do this again. So I think it's important just to say that there's a very important moment that we seem to have entered. I understand this short news flash that apparently Donald Trump was acquitted some moments ago in the Senate deliberations. Something new will therefore be occurring by tomorrow in some way. But I think what's important is that determining by means of having these discussions a new level of intelligence to become available to the American people and everybody, and that this dialogue process, this higher idea of getting away from the notion of the violence of the political discourse we've seen to a higher principle. That's what we've just done. I want to thank everybody for being involved in that. And I would also encourage everybody here who may not have seen our tribute to Lyndon LaRouche yesterday, which is sort of a marathon that went on for over 17 hours. Take a look at that. That's up at the LaRouche organization site. So on behalf of the Schiller Institute, I'd like to conclude at this point, and we'll see you again for this and other kinds of activities. Good evening.